Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe, as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. This took place about 15 years ago, when I was 21, living in my very first apartment. It was a small bachelor unit in a pretty sketchy area. Having grown up in a rough town, I knew how to handle myself and had learned early on to keep my head down and avoid trouble. The apartment building was located behind a bar, and many of the bar's customers would step outside to smoke. From where they stood, they could easily see my apartment. Most of the people out there kept to themselves, and occasionally someone would nod or say hello if I passed by. But I had never had any issues until one particular evening. That night, after I got home from work, I walked past the bar and noticed a tall man standing outside smoking. As I passed him, he just stared at me. I gave him a nod, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't dwell on it and continued inside. An hour later, I heard a knock on my door. This was strange because you had to be buzzed into the building, and I didn't know anyone in my building's small 8 units. I froze for a moment, not wanting to engage with whoever it was, but the knocking persisted. Finally, I shouted, "Who's it?" But there was no response. I asked again, "Who's there?" And the man's voice answered, "It's Tom." I didn't know anyone named Tom, so I reply, "I don't know anyone named Tom. You've got the wrong apartment." Then the voice said, "You may not know me, but I know you. Open up so we can talk." I went to the peephole and saw the tall man from the bar standing outside my door. That was enough for me. I shouted, "Get lost or I'm calling the cops." I heard him walk away, and the building door open and close. He was gone, or so I thought. A few minutes later, I glanced out my window, and there he was standing in the parking lot, talking to himself. Panic started to set in. I called my landlord, who lived next door, and told him what was going on. He advised me to call the police and said he and his brother would come over to check things out. In the meantime, I called the police, explained the situation, and they said a car was on the way. Meanwhile, I watched from my window as my landlord and his brother approached the man in the parking lot. As soon as the tall man saw them, he bolted. They tried to chase him, but he managed to escape. The police arrived a few minutes later. I gave them a full description of what had happened and described the man to the best of my ability. The officer looked at me and said, "We've had reports of a man matching that description who's been sexually assaulting women. Thank God you didn't open the door." A few days later, I got a call from the same officer. As part of their investigation, they had spoken with the owner of the bar. Apparently, the man had returned to the bar after a few days, and the owner immediately called the police. They arrested him on the spot. So, to the tall, creepy dude from the Bart Hankley, it was a close call, and I hope I never run into you again. A couple of years ago, I moved into a new house with my family after being evicted from our previous one. We're in the same area, but the owners of our old place wanted to move in, so we had to relocate. I see a fence and then a neighboring house, which sits on a small hill, making it easy for them to see over into our yard. The first unsettling encounter I had with one of the neighbors happened late one night. I was home with a few friends while all of our parents were out at a party. Just for context, we're old enough to be left alone, and we were being responsible, nothing out of the ordinary. We had the TV off, No loud music, just hanging out in my room with the lights dimmed. Suddenly, my dog started barking nonstop for about 10 minutes. Normally, she barks at everything, birds, bugs, you name it, so we didn't think much of it at first. But then we started hearing strange noises, like crunching sounds and scratching that seemed to be circling around my room. Before we could figure out what was happening, there was a loud, aggressive banging on the glass sliding door in my room. The kind of banging that makes your heart skip a beat. The three of us panicked and bolted out of my room to see what could possibly be causing it. When we reached the door, we saw a dog, an aggressive one, pounding on the glass. My own dog, who normally doesn't get scared, backed away from the door, first standing on end, and then we saw him, a man dressed all in black, standing right outside. We froze, trying to process what we were seeing. My friend's flight response kicked in, and just as he lunged to lock the door, the man reached for it too. The man responded with a chilling, "I don't know," before casually walking away with his dog, which, oddly enough, was on a leash. When our parents got home, we told them everything. They asked why we hadn't called them earlier, and honestly, I don't know why either. I guess I didn't want to ruin my mom's night. But looking back, I know we should have called right away. A couple of days later, my mom confronted our neighbor while he was out mowing his lawn. He admitted it was him that night and claimed that his dog had somehow run through our gate, so he had to come retrieve it. He said he meant to tell her sooner, but didn't get the chance. It seemed like a reasonable explanation until I thought more about it. The gate he supposedly came through has a tough clasp, which was securely closed that night. We have it there to make sure our dog doesn't get out, and it's not the type of gate that just swings open on its own. This meant that he had to have opened it himself. My theory, he heard the music stop and saw no lights on, and maybe thought the house was empty. So he decided to snoop around. Those noises we heard must have been him lurking outside, trying to find a way in. We filed a police report, but nothing came of it. For a while, things were quiet until one night. I was in bed, getting ready to fall asleep, when I sat up to rearrange my pillows. As I turned around to fix them, I saw something that made my heart stop. A face. There was someone staring at me through my window, their face covered with a black mask. I froze in terror and texted my mom, unable to move. By the time she came to check, the figure was gone. But I know what I saw. The face had blocked out the light from my neighbor's house that usually filters through a crack in my curtain. Ever since that night, I've caught glimpses of them, whoever it is watching me from their balcony. Every time I catch them staring, they quickly get up and disappear, only to reappear minutes later in the same spot, watching again. So, to my creepy neighbor who watches me relentlessly, let's never meet again. I-40F attended the university at Buffalo in the early 2000s, fresh out of high school. Back then, the internet was like the Wild West, and finding information wasn't as easy as it is today. Colleges had a much easier time hiding things, especially when it came to campus crime stats. When I attended orientation before my freshman year, one of the presentations was about campus safety. The student aides proudly told us that North Campus was in Amherst, at the time labeled the safest town in the country. They briefly mentioned a murder that had occurred 9 years prior. Linda Yalom, a student, was killed on the campus's bike path during an early morning run. They brushed it off, assuring us that avoiding the path at night would keep us safe. What they didn't mention, the killer was still out there, and Yalom wasn't his only victim. He was a serial rapist and, eventually, a serial killer who had been active for decades. Knowing this beforehand might have saved me from one of the most terrifying encounters of my life. Fast forward 3 years, and I was a very different person. At 20, I was depressed, struggling with my sexual identity, and dealing with my parents' reaction to it in a much less accepting time. I had dropped out of school, and to avoid being home, I moved in with a woman who, at first, promised me the world. That didn't last. On the night I moved in, she rekindled things with her ex-girlfriend and shut me out. She eventually turned out to be a felon. But that's another story for another time. Despite all the red flags, I stayed with her, clinging to the naive hope that things would change. One July night, that hope died for good. I was at Roxy's Green Room, a now-closed lesbian bar in Buffalo. Many of us frequented it to feel a sense of community and to meet someone special, but I was still hung up on my roommate. She played with my emotions, and after promising to come to Roxy's alone with me to talk about our relationship, she showed up with her ex, shutting me out once again. Heartbroken, I left around 1 a.m., earlier than usual, and without securing a ride home, a rookie mistake for someone like me who knew better. My apartment wasn't far, just about a half-hour walk down Main Street. Angry and upset, I ignored the common-sense rule that no woman should walk alone at night, especially after leaving a bar. Halfway home, a dark green sedan pulled up beside me. At first, I didn't think much of it until the car slowed down, and the driver, a middle-aged man with dark hair and almost soulless, pitch-black eyes, looked at me. His expression was unsettling, but I brushed it off, assuming he was just another creep ogling me because I was wearing a tight red crop top and black flare pants. The car drove off, turning at the next intersection, and I thought that was the end of it. But a couple of minutes later, the same car reappeared. This time, the man's window was slightly down, and he shouted, "Hey," while gesturing toward me. Annoyed, I shot him a look and kept walking, hoping he'd get the hint. He sped off again, but turned once more. At that point, it was clear he wasn't just some random guy. He was stalking me. The streets were empty, and I had no cell phone, no Uber to call, and no taxis in sight. Public transit wasn't running nearby, and I was too far from either Roxy's or my apartment to make it before he came around again. Panic set in. I remembered watching true crime shows and recall that if you're in trouble, you should get to an open business and ask for help. I was approaching a convenience store across the street where I'd bought cigarettes earlier that night, but as I got closer, I saw it was closed. There were no other open bars or gas stations around, just dark, locked-up buildings. Then the green sedan appeared again. The man's demeanor had shifted. He was angry now, glaring at me as he put his hand out, demanding my attention. "Come on," he shouted, frustration dripping from his voice. I stayed out of arm's reach and kept walking. But this time fear gripped me. His persistence meant he wasn't going to give up easily. I knew I was in real trouble. His behavior was escalating, and I was terrified he would try to grab me. My mind raced, trying to think of another safety tip. Then it hit me. Make a scene. If I couldn't escape, I could at least draw attention. I ran into the middle of Main Street, waving my arms frantically at any passing cars, shouting for help. The first car sped past. Then the second. My heart pounded as I feared I would end up like one of those true crime stories where bystanders do nothing. Was this how it would end for me? Just as I was about to lose hope, a van pulled over. Inside were four black men, and as a white woman, I felt oddly relieved. Statistically, predators target their own race, so I knew the men in the van were safer than the stalker in the green car. Desperate, I took a chance. I frantically explained the situation, telling them about the man who kept circling and following me. The driver asked if I had any money for the ride home, but I didn't. Then he asked if I had cigarettes. I did. I had picked up the habit because it was part of Buffalo's lesbian bar culture at the time. Yes, I blurted out, you can have the whole pack if you get me home. Admittedly, I was initially a little miffed that the driver wanted something from me in exchange for not letting me get abducted off the street, as well as the implication that he may not have helped me if I had nothing. Still, I had the Marlboros. He had a vehicle, and the stars had hopefully aligned. Regardless of how it went down, I had help if he let me in, and the details didn't matter. After what seemed like an eternity, the driver agreed, and one of the guys in the back opened the side door for me and got out so I could slide into the seat behind the driver. As the door to my temporary sanctuary closed, I buckled in and looked out just in time to see the green car slowly creeping past the van, its driver proving my story right. I will never forget that man's eyes. There was something chilling in them, blacker than anything I had ever seen, like a predator who had just lost its prey. A surge of fear mixed with relief coursed through me, and part of me wanted to stare him down. But something in his hateful glare told me I wasn't safe just yet. He drove off into the night, and we took a longer, winding route to make sure we weren't being followed. When I finally made it home, one pack of cigarettes lighter, but alive, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a freight train. I immediately checked every lock in my apartment. Once the adrenaline wore off, I became paralyzed with fear, thinking the man in the green car might be lurking nearby, trying to find me. I grabbed the phone, lying flat on the floor for hours to stay out of sight from the windows. Then I dialed the Buffalo police and told them everything. I feared this might be a hate crime, that the man had targeted me because I had been at Roxy's, a known LGBTQ+ bar. But in retrospect, I think he was just a predator who saw a vulnerable woman walking alone and took his chance. Fast forward for years. By 2007, I had moved to Chicago to live with my then girlfriend. I missed Buffalo, feeling isolated in a city where I knew no one except her. To stay connected to my hometown, I kept tabs on the local news. One morning in January, I stumbled upon a headline that set my heart racing. Bike path rapist is arrested. The bike path rapist I'd heard about him before, a shadowy figure responsible for terrorizing women for years in the Buffalo area. And now they had a name, Altamio Sanchez. As I read the article, my stomach dropped. Sanchez, a man described as a friendly, community-minded coach who blended into suburban life, had been active for decades, preying on women. He had raped between 9 and 15 women and murdered at least 3, including Linda Yalom, whose murder I had heard about during freshman orientation. He had been active during the exact time I had lived in Buffalo. He had been active during that night in 2003, when I encountered a man in a green car with dark, predatory eyes. I didn't know if you've ever had the feeling of your heart leaping into your throat and then plunging into your stomach all at once, but that was what happened to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered Sanchez that night. The profile fit. His timing, his demeanor, his method of preying on vulnerable women. I had to know. I searched for a photo of him, and when I finally found one, the recognition was immediate. I knew those eyes. I had stared into them on that summer night in Buffalo. I was sure, as terrifying as it was to accept, I had come face to face with Altamio Sanchez, the bike path rapist, and survived. The realization that I had been so close to becoming one of his victims was nauseating. If those guys in the van hadn't pulled over when they did, I could have disappeared. Just another tragic statistic. Sanchez was ultimately sentenced to 75 years to life in prison, where he remains today. With his capture, Buffalo, at least, could breathe a little easier. But as for me, I still have nightmares about those eyes, the eyes of a man who would have done unspeakable things had I not gotten away. So, to the bike path rapist, even though you'll never be free again, let's never meet. This took place about 15 years ago, when I was 21, living in my very first apartment. It was a small bachelor unit in a pretty sketchy area. Having grown up in a rough town, I knew how to handle myself and had learned early on to keep my head down and avoid trouble. The apartment building was located behind a bar, and many of the bar's customers would step outside to smoke. From where they stood, they could easily see my apartment. Most of the people out there kept to themselves, and occasionally someone would nod or say hello if I passed by. But I had never had any issues until one particular evening. That night, after I got home from work, I walked past the bar and noticed a tall man standing outside smoking. As I passed him, he just stared at me. I gave him a nod, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't dwell on it and continued inside. An hour later, I heard a knock on my door. This was strange because you had to be buzzed into the building, and I didn't know anyone in my building's small 8 units. I froze for a moment, not wanting to engage with whoever it was, but the knocking persisted. Finally, I shouted, "Who is it?" But there was no response. I asked again, "Who's there?" And the man's voice answered, "It's Tom." I didn't know anyone named Tom, so I reply, "I don't know anyone named Tom. You've got the wrong apartment." Then the voice said, "You may not know me, but I know you. Open up so we can talk." I went to the peephole and saw the tall man from the bar standing outside my door. That was enough for me. I shouted, "Get lost or I'm calling the cops." I heard him walk away, and the building door open and close. He was gone, or so I thought. A few minutes later, I glanced out my window, and there he was standing in the parking lot, talking to himself. Panic started to set in. I called my landlord, who lived next door, and told him what was going on. He advised me to call the police and said he and his brother would come over to check things out. In the meantime, I called the police, explained the situation, and they said a car was on the way. Meanwhile, I watched from my window as my landlord and his brother approached the man in the parking lot. As soon as the tall man saw them, he bolted. They tried to chase him, but he managed to escape. The police arrived a few minutes later. I gave them a full description of what had happened and described the man to the best of my ability. The officer looked at me and said, "We've had reports of a man matching that description who's been sexually assaulting women. Thank God you didn't open the door." A few days later, I got a call from the same officer. As part of their investigation, they had spoken with the owner of the bar. Apparently, the man had returned to the bar after a few days, and the owner immediately called the police. They arrested him on the spot. So, to the tall, creepy dude from the bar, thankfully, it was a close call, and I hope I never run into you again. Hi, this happened just a few hours ago, and I'm still pretty shaken up. It's too early to call my friends and wake them, but I need to get this out. I'm creeped out and concerned, so I figured I'd share what happened here. For some background, I'm a woman in my 30s staying at my childhood home to care for my elderly parents. My bedroom is on the ground floor, and the window faces a quiet residential street. It's usually peaceful, and I leave the window open night because I need it to be cool to sleep. There's a cabinet with an aquarium in front of the window, which I've always figured would make it difficult for someone to climb in. Plus, my dog, Sable, sleeps in the room with me. She's not big or threatening, but she's alert. If she hears something unusual, she growl or bark. I've always felt secure with her around, even with the window open. That changed tonight. It started around 3:30 or 4 a.m. I was still awake, as my sleep is often broken because of my caregiving responsibilities. I was reading when Sable suddenly growled, low and deep, the way she does when something isn't right. She jumped off the bed and started pacing, her eyes fixed on the window. Then she leapt up at the cabinet by the window, barking furiously. "Alarm!" I shouted. "Hey, we're calling the police. The dog will bite." Just in case someone was out there, I went to peek out of the curtains, but didn't see anything. I calmed down a little, figuring it might have been an animal. We have foxes in the area, and sometimes Sable reacts to the occasional passerby or a neighbor's gate creaking. I wasn't too concerned. I even took the extra step of closing the curtains properly, making sure the wind wouldn't blow them open again. I figured that if it was someone checking out the window, they'd realize the room was occupied and move on. But mostly I convinced myself it was nothing serious. I was wrong. Maybe half an hour later, Sable growled again. This time, it was even more serious, a deep rumbling growl from her chest. I sat up, trying to listen for what had triggered her, and that's when I heard it, this horrible, heavy breathing. It was like something out of a horror movie, the kind of creepy breathing a stalker makes on the phone in those thriller films. My heart dropped. I looked at the window, and to my horror, the curtain had been pulled back. Not only that, but it was lifted at the bottom, like someone was peeking under it. The breathing continued. Panicking, I shouted, "Hey!" again, and jumped out of bed, moving to the side of the window to get a look outside. That's when I saw him, a dark figure of a man, moving away from the window and towards the front door of the house. It was too dark to make out any details, just a male figure walking off into the night. I was shaking, but I knew I had to act quickly. Since he wasn't at the window anymore, I rushed to shut it. My hands were trembling as I locked it, and then I grabbed my phone and called emergency services. Now that I've had a little time to process, what creeps me out the most is that he didn't run off right away when I first shouted. He stayed there, breathing heavily for a few more seconds until I actually got up and moved toward the window. It's like he wanted to frighten me. That breathing, it was so loud and deliberate, like he was trying to scare me on purpose. While I was on the phone with the police, I went around the house turning on all the lights and double-checking that the rest of the doors and windows were locked. Thankfully, everything was secure. The police arrived around 5 a.m., just as the sky was beginning to lighten. They took my statement, but since I didn't get a clear description, just the outline of a man, they weren't able to do much. The officers suggested I ask the neighbors tomorrow if they have any camera footage and to let them know about a possible prowler in the area. I still feel so unsettled. I don't know if they'll find anything or if this guy will come back, but I doubt I'll be sleeping with the window open again anytime soon. I'm still shaken, but now the shock is giving way to anger and a sense of violation. I never thought I'd be in a situation where I'd need security cameras, but now that's all I can think about. We'll definitely be looking into getting a system soon. The whole thing just feels so random. I have no enemies, no recent exes, no one I can think of who might hold a grudge. I don't even socialize much these days. with most of my time spent caring for my parents. They're elderly and disabled, so they're not exactly out there making enemies either. I'm in my late 30s, and honestly, I live in jeans, t-shirts, and joggers most of the time. No makeup, no fussing with my hair. I don't exactly scream target for some pervert. If it weren't for Sable alerting me both times, I might have convinced myself that I was dreaming. But she knew something was wrong, and I'm sure now that I wasn't just imagining it. I'm not on any drugs, and I almost never drink. While I've had hallucinations once before, a bad reaction to antidepressants that was over a decade ago, and it hasn't happened since. Plus, I've learned how to test my reality ever since. The advice I got back then was to check if others can see or hear what I'm experiencing, or to look for logical explanations. Well, Sable definitely sensed someone was there, and I heard and saw them. This wasn't a hallucination, and I wasn't asleep. I'm far too skeptical to believe in anything supernatural, and while I love horror movies, they don't get under my skin anymore. But this has, I keep trying to make sense of it. Was it someone trying to scope out the house for a burglary? Maybe, but they came back later, even after realizing the room was occupied. That's what I can't shake. Why come back? It could have been someone on drugs or in the middle of a mental health crisis. But the possibility that unsettles me most is that they wanted to scare me. But why? What kind of person does that? Now I'm plagued with new fears. They know where I live. What's to stop them from coming back? Most nights I'm up late or in the early hours of the morning, and I let Sable out in the backyard for a quick pee. I've suddenly realized just how vulnerable I am then. There's a narrow passage around the side of the house, leading from the front to the back. The gate is small, just enough to keep the dog in, but it wouldn't keep anyone out. Someone could easily slip through and hide behind the house, completely out of view. The fact that they had the boldness to return after the first encounter chills me to my core. They knew I was there, that there was a dog in the room, and they still came back. Were they hoping I'd fallen asleep by then? The heavy breathing felt so intentional, like they were trying to terrify me, and what scares me most is that they stayed. Even after I shouted, even after they knew they'd been seen, they didn't immediately run. They lingered just long enough for me to reach the window, move the curtains, and see them. Only then did they leave. That deliberate, deep breathing followed by the moment when I saw the man move away from the window. It's going to haunt me for a long time. But the worst part is not knowing why. Were they trying to scare me on purpose? Was it all some sick game to them? And the question I can't escape: what if they come back? Back when I was younger, I used to hang out with my friend Billy and his older brother Jack almost every weekend. They lived down the road from a reclusive neighbor who lived on a hill nearby, but I never paid much attention to him at first. One night, while I was staying over, I had trouble sleeping. We had been playing horror games, and my mind was still racing. As I lay in the living room, which had 3 large windows facing the balcony, I suddenly heard a creaking noise outside. My heart started pounding as I glanced out the window and saw a flash of light. I panicked and woke everyone up. Billy's parents rushed out onto the balcony, catching a glimpse of a man sprinting away into the darkness. We were all terrified, but somehow we managed to make it through the night, trying to distract ourselves with snacks and movies. Even though the fear lingered, the following weekend, things took an even stranger turn. A man appeared at the door, holding a camera and recording us without our knowledge. We didn't even notice him until Billy's dad saw him standing there. Furious, the dad ran outside, yelling at the man, and chased him down the road. The police were called, and the man was identified as Daniel Vincent Kelly. At the time, we had no idea how much worse things would get. A week later, we saw Daniel again. This time he was in a large parking lot near a lake, visible from the house. He was riding his bike in circles under a street light, sometimes staring up at the house. The sight sent chills down our spines. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he just kept riding, shirtless, in the distance, as if he were waiting for something. When he finally disappeared, we stayed inside, weapons in hand, bracing ourselves for what might happen next. The next weekend, we woke up in the middle of the night to a loud noise outside. When we went to investigate, we found Daniel's bike propped up against the side of the house. That was the last straw. We called the authorities again. This time, they discovered that Daniel had been posting videos online, including recordings of us, without our knowledge. The most disturbing part, he had been filming us for much longer than we had realized. The most chilling videos were eventually deleted due to legal issues, but one that still haunts me is still online. In the video, Daniel walked around claiming that a hole in my friend's screen door allowed their dog to escape and attack his dog. He went on to accuse my friend's mother of quickly repairing the screen to cover it up, a claim that was blatantly false. There had never been a hole in the door. Even though the scariest videos are gone, I still remember them vividly. There were at least 20 videos of Daniel secretly filming us. Some were in broad daylight, where he would hide behind a hill, calling us names as we played on the porch. In some of the videos, he even made threats, which was the most terrifying part. Eventually, I wasn't allowed to go over to Billy's house anymore, and I don't know how it'll end. I have never seen Daniel Vincent Kelly again, and I don't know if he was ever arrested or if he simply moved away. What I do know is that those encounters left a lasting impression on me. To this day, I get anxious whenever I see a window at night, and I can't help but wonder what might have happened if he had never been caught. This might not be the scariest thing compared to other stories here, but the experience has stuck with me over the years, and I feel like this is the place to share it. So here goes. I must have been about 5 or 6 years old. I went to the local kindergarten, carefree, with my biggest worry being whether my mom would forget to pick me up from school. She never did. Every day we would walk to and from school together since it was just a short distance. We lived in a secluded compound, mostly inhabited by elderly people or boarding students attending the nearby university. Nothing ever seemed out of place there, or dangerous for that matter. That morning started like any other. My mom came to pick me up, and we were walking along the small path in our compound with 4 other people. 3 high schoolers, 2 of them walking together, and a college student holding a handkerchief over her head to shield herself from the midday sun. It was scorching, the sun high in the sky, and everything seemed calm. You'd never expect anything bad to happen on a day like that, but it did. As we walked, I turned around and saw a man suddenly join our group. He didn't belong there. He was carrying a bright neon green bag slung in front of him, slightly open, with one of his hands inside it. His clothes were dusty, and what really stood out was the way he was glaring at us. Just us 5 walking in this quiet, secluded compound, and he had this intense, unnerving look. I didn't think much of it at first. I was just a kid. But my mom, she must have sensed something. She squeezed my hand, and suddenly we were walking faster. At first, I didn't understand what was going on. but I knew my mom well enough to recognize that when she was alarmed, something was wrong. I tried to glance back discreetly, although I'm sure I wasn't being that subtle, and the man kept glaring at us, getting closer with every step. I looked up at my mom, trying to ask what was happening, but all I could catch was the word knife and her whispered murmurs. That's when I felt my stomach drop. As a child, you see danger in cartoons or hear about it in stories, but you never really expect to be in real danger yourself. Yet here we were with my short legs unable to move fast enough. I knew we were the easy target. My mom was around 50 years old at the time, and compared to the other people walking ahead of us, we were falling behind. I looked at our house in the distance, telling myself to focus on getting there instead of thinking about the man behind us. Still, I couldn't stop looking back. He kept getting closer, closing the gap. I remember wanting to scream for help, but I couldn't. I desperately scanned the houses we passed, hoping someone was home, that someone would help. But my mom's grip was firm, and all I could do was focus on reaching our front door. The others walking with us didn't seem to notice, at least, not at first. One of the high schoolers left to go into a house near the basketball court, and further down the path. The other two veered off towards the main highway. Now it was just us and the female college student, perfect to man, now speeding up, was almost on top of us. But we were only a few steps from our apartment. My mom and I dashed toward the door, hurried up the stairs, and slammed it shut behind us. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it would burst. I stood frozen while my mom locked the door and rushed to the window, her voice shaky. He has a knife. I saw it, ... He single quotes us holding a knife. I ran to the window and saw the girl still walking ahead of the man, holding her handkerchief, looking back in fear as he followed her. His bright neon bag was now wide open, his hand still inside it, gripping something. He didn't stop until they both disappeared from view. I don't know what happened after that. My mom later told me she noticed the man almost as soon as I had, her suspicions rising when he didn't try to pass us like everyone else. Instead, he stayed close, too close, and when she saw his hand gripping the knife in his bag, she knew we had to get away fast. I still wonder sometimes, was that girl okay? Did she manage to get away, or did he catch up to her? And what about the man? Was he ever caught? It's been years now, and I've never found out. I don't even know if I want to. But the memory of that bright neon bag, the silent threat it held, and the terror of that moment, those things have stayed with me ever since. As a college student without a car, I often rely on biking, walking, and the bus to get around. My campus offers free transit for students, so I frequently use the bus for grocery runs or to treat myself. Recently, after a rough week of exams, I decided to go see Terrifier 2 in theaters. As a horror movie fan, it seemed like the perfect way to unwind. I planned everything in advance, but looking back, something in my gut had told me to pick an earlier showing. One wish I had listened out. On the day of the movie, I boarded the smaller bus that runs on campus. Since I was getting on at the first stop, the driver had parked for a quick break before starting the route. Inside the bus were two other passengers, a girl about my age sitting in the front, and an older man in the second row. I found a seat several rows behind them, on the right side, and settled in with my phone as usual. Things were fine at first, but after a while I noticed the older men repeatedly staring at me. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as harmless at first. But then he started talking loudly. "Beautiful baby," he muttered, "so damn fine." My heart began to race. I froze, unsure of how to respond, and kept my eyes glued to my phone. He didn't stop, though. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered up the courage to speak. "Sir, would you please stop staring at me?" I asked, my voice shaking. He denied staring and followed up by saying, "You're extremely beautiful." I had no idea what to say, so I awkwardly thanked him and looked back down at my phone, hoping that would be the end of it. The bus driver returned, and the bus began moving again. I thought the worst was over, but I was wrong. The man started again, this time saying things that made my stomach churn. "Gonna make you my wife," he mumbled, then added, "I'm gonna get you pregnant." At that point, I was trembling. My mind raced with panic, and all I could think about was how to get out of this situation. I desperately wanted to move and sit by the other girl, but I was too afraid to walk past him. When we reached the next stop, the girl got off the bus, and my heart sank. I was alone with this creep. Thankfully, more people boarded: a middle-aged couple and a guy about my age. Without thinking, I called out to the younger guy and asked him to sit with me. He looked confused, but he came over and sat down next to me. Immediately, a wave of relief washed over me, and I couldn't hold back my tears. The stress and fear of the situation had overwhelmed me. The creep must have sensed he was no longer in control, because he quickly got off the bus after seeing me cry. I was still shaking, but the guy who sat with me began talking to comfort me. We chatted about our majors. He was a graduate student in mechanical engineering, and I shared that I wanted to go into marine biology. The bus driver noticed something was wrong and called me up to the front. He explained that although he hadn't heard anything, the bus was equipped with video cameras that would hopefully capture the man's behavior. The driver told me that the same guy had been kicked off the bus recently for similar incidents, and that he would report the situation immediately. The rest of the bus ride passed more peacefully, and I managed to get to the movies safely. Terrified was a great distraction, but even after the movie ended, I couldn't shake the unease from the earlier encounter. My boyfriend has since offered to help me find self-defense tools and taught me a few basic fighting techniques. Though I made it home safely, the experience left a lasting impression on me. It's terrifying how quickly a seemingly normal day can turn into something straight out of a nightmare. Creepy encounters can happen anywhere, and it's important to stay vigilant, even when you least expect it. This incident happened to me a couple of years ago, but it still freaks me out whenever I think about it. It was around midnight, and I was in my room, casually browsing my phone, when I heard what sounded like knocking outside my bedroom window. My room is on the ground floor, so it was definitely closed. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a squirrel or some other animal. But then the same knocking came again, and this time it was louder. My heart started to race. Concerned, I left my room and called my dad, telling him about the knocking sounds. He tried to reassure me that it was probably nothing, but while we were talking, I heard more knocking, this time from the front door. The sound was deliberate, slow, and eerie, like someone was testing to see if anyone was inside. I called out, thinking maybe it was my brother playing a prank or someone in the house messing with me, but I got no answer. That's when the fear really started to set in. As I stood there, trying to figure out what was happening, I heard something far more terrifying: the sound of someone trying to force open the back door. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was, they weren't knocking anymore. They were trying to break in. I froze for a second, completely terrified, before my dog finally caught on. He started barking like crazy, growling and scratching at the back door. Whoever was out there must have been startled because after a few moments of struggle, the noise stopped and everything went silent. I was shaking, barely able to think straight. I grabbed my phone and, instead of calling the police, I dialed my grandpa, who lived just a block away. I was too panicked to think clearly. All I wanted was to get out of that house. I grabbed a kitchen knife and sat on the couch, trembling and clutching it tightly, waiting for my grandpa to arrive. Every sound in the house felt magnified, and the minute seemed like hours. When my grandpa finally pulled into the driveway, I bolted out of the house and into his car. Even though the immediate danger was over, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The whole drive back to his place, my mind raced with possibilities. Who could it have been? Why were they trying to get in? The only theory I could come up with was that someone had followed me home earlier that day. I had taken a walk alone along a nature trail nearby, and it's the only thing that made any sense to me. Later, I learned that there were reports of drifters living in the woods around that time, which only added to my suspicion. But I never found out for sure who was out there that night or what their intentions were. That experience was one of the scariest things I've ever been through, and it still affects me. Even now I get uneasy when I'm home alone at night, and every little sound makes my heart race. I've learned to trust my instincts, and if I ever hear knocking in the dark again, I'll make sure to call the police right away. What I'm about to describe sounds like a bad horror movie cliché, but I swear this really happened. To this day, barely anyone believes me without hearing confirmation from my friends who were there. It's a long story, so buckle up. It was autumn of 2019, and I was in British Columbia, Canada. I'm from Germany, but I was spending half a year in Canada as part of my bachelor's degree. I barely made it back home before COVID hit. I was 22 years old at the time, and my friends in this story were around the same age. Another foreign student, and I had befriended a local Canadian student. We shared similar interests and had the same sense of humor, so we got along really well. This Canadian dude became one of our best friends while we were there. He'd show us around the local area, and earlier this summer, he even took us out to a remote cabin his dad owned near the woods. We spent a week there, shooting guns, drinking, and just having a blast. His dad taught us how to handle the guns safely and let us shoot as much as we wanted, which, by the way, ammo is expensive as hell. When fall came around, we had a lot of free time since we'd finished all our school papers, so our Canadian buddy suggested we head back to his dad's cabin for a few days. But this time without his father, we were all for it. The plan was to load up on booze, weed, and just enjoy ourselves, three friends out in the woods, gaming and getting wasted. Sounds great, right? The first 3 days were chill. On the first night, though I barely slept, I tend to be a pretty paranoid guy, and it's not uncommon for me to go into alert mode, which my friends often tease me about. The isolation out there got to me. There's something unnerving about being so far from civilization. You don't realize how quiet the world can be until you're deep in the wilderness, where the silence is almost unnatural. It made me restless, and I found myself standing outside at night just listening to the stillness. But after a couple of days I started to relax. I was with my buddies. We were high most of the time, and we had guns with us, probably more of a danger to ourselves than anyone else. But still, then came day 4. We spent most of it lazily hunting in the woods, which was basically just us sitting under trees with beers and rifles in hand. By the evening, it started to rain hard. After about an hour, lightning began flashing in the distance, with long stretches of time between the strikes, and the thunder, meaning the storm was still pretty far off. We decided to call off our half-hearted hunting and head back to the cabin. The rain had made the ground slick and difficult to walk on, so it took us about an hour to get back in the dark. Now, when you've been out in the wilderness for days without seeing anyone but your friends, you get pretty careless about your surroundings. You feel like you're alone in the world. We finally got back, soaked from the rain, and settled in for the night. The storm outside was raging by now. We changed clothes, but kept our guns close. Yeah, I know guns and drugs are a terrible combination, and I wouldn't mix that stuff nowadays. But we had been drilled well by our friend's dad on gun safety. And honestly, there's something weirdly comforting about having a rifle with you when you're out in the middle of nowhere. The three of us were cozied up in the cabin's living room, playing cards at the table with a YouTube video running in the background. We didn't bother closing the curtains because the storm outside looked incredible, lightning flashing, thunder rolling. It was pitch black outside, except for those brief moments when the lightning lit up the sky. The lamps in the cabin were old, dim, and barely lit the room. Then it happened. I didn't see it first. My non-local friend did. He was taking a sip of his beer, and another lightning strike lit up the outside. He immediately spat his drink out and screamed, jumping up from his chair. No words, just panic. My Canadian friend and I stared at him, confused. "There's somebody outside," he shouted. He started rambling, saying that when the lightning flashed, he saw a person standing a short distance away from the cabin, looking directly at us. Now, I know this sounds like the start of a bad horror story, but I swear this really happened. My unknown local friend was panicking, and the look on his face told me he wasn't joking around. He had seen someone. I grabbed my rifle and chambered around, feeling the adrenaline shoot through my body. My heart was racing as I tried to peer out into the darkness, staying far away from the window, but I couldn't see anything. Meanwhile, our Canadian friend rushed to his room and grabbed his pistol. It had a flashlight attached to it. I realized then that we hadn't even locked the door. Why would we? We hadn't seen another soul for days. But now I sprinted to lock it. Our Canadian buddy came back with his pistol and flashlight. He slowly approached the window, then suddenly threw it open, aiming the gun outside with the flashlight on. What we saw next has haunted me ever since. The light cut through the rain, and there, crouching just a few steps from the cabin, was a man. He was tall and thin, wearing all black, with a hooded raincoat pulled down over his face, almost covering his eyes. He was crouching down, not standing like our friend had thought, and he was looking directly at us. His eyes were squinted, and there was this horrifying little smirk on one side of his mouth. Another flash of lightning lit up the scene. None of us moved. It was like time froze. That man, crouching so close to the window, his face barely visible under the hood, smirking at us through the storm, there was something deeply wrong about it, something that triggered a primal fear in all of us. Our Canadian friend broke the silence, his voice shaky and higher pitched than I'd ever heard. "Gee, get the fuck away from us or we'll shoot." At that moment, I think the man realized the flashlight wasn't just a flashlight, but that there was a gun aimed directly at him. His smirk shifted to something else, either shock or anger. I couldn't tell. All of this happened in under a minute, but it felt like hours. As my friend kept yelling, and I stood frozen, the man slowly turned 90 degrees toward the tree line. Then, in a split second, he was on his feet and sprinting away from the cabin, disappearing into the rain and darkness. We were left in stunned silence, staring at each other. Unable to comprehend what had just happened, we spent the rest of that night sleeping in shifts. One of us stayed awake, standing guard, while the others tried their best to sleep. When it was my turn, the rain had calmed down, and the cabin was almost completely quiet. I turned off all the lights, opened a window, and just sat there in the dark, trying to listen for any sound, any movement. I stared out into the blackness, scanning for anything unusual. When you're sitting like that, in the dark, fully alert and tense for hours, you have a lot of time to think, and my mind kept replaying what had just happened. By the middle of the next day, the police officers finally arrived. They asked us to recount everything and detail what had happened, when it happened, and which direction the man had run off. We showed them the spot where the raincoat figure had crouched and where he disappeared into the woods. The cops promised they'd organize a patrol to search the area, but warned us it might take some time since they needed experienced trackers who knew the wilderness well. We told them that we didn't see the man's face clearly, only that he was tall and clean-shaven. His age was impossible to guess. The chances of catching him or even figuring out what he wanted seemed slim. Still, one of the officers told us they were deeply concerned by the whole incident. After the police left, we decided to pack up and leave the cabin. Our Canadian friend's dad insisted we stay at his place for at least a day, just to feel safe again. He wanted to hear every detail about what had happened and decided that the time had come to install cameras around the cabin, something he had been putting off. I think I remember hearing later that the dad and his brother had gone back to the cabin, sitting there in the dark, waiting to see if the raincoat man would return. But as far as I know, they never found him. It's as if he vanished into the woods. We never heard from the cops again. I left Canada in January of the following year and returned home to Germany. A few months later, my Canadian friend got called in for an interview by the police. Apparently, they were still investigating the incident, trying to find out who this guy was. Even though no new details emerged, it was strange to think the police were still taking it seriously months after the fact. That image, the man crouched in the rain, soaked to the bone, grinning just outside the window in total darkness, has stayed with me. I still think about it, even now, years later. Sometimes I'll turn off all the lights in my apartment and stare out the windows, listening for any sound, as if I'm back in that cabin again. We've speculated endlessly about what the guy's intentions might have been. None of us believe it was just an attempted burglary. Our lights were on, and it was obvious there were people inside, but that didn't deter him. Instead of walking away when he was spotted, he crouched down and came closer to the window. It felt calculated, like he was trying to figure out what kind of people were in the cabin, who his potential victims were. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't been 3 armed guys. What if it had been 2 unarmed girls alone in that cabin? The thought still sends chills down my spine. The man didn't have a backpack, didn't seem to be carrying anything other than the raincoat on his back. There were no headlights or sounds of an approaching vehicle, which means he probably didn't drive up. He must have had some kind of camp set up in the woods, or at the very least, a car hidden somewhere nearby. And he knew what he was doing. He was prepared, experienced. He either stumbled upon the cabin during the storm or had seen us earlier while we were out hunting. I keep thinking about how easy it would have been for him to spot us in the pitch-black wilderness. We were slow and not careful about waving our flashlights around. Out there in complete darkness, a flashlight would have been like a beacon. He could have tracked us back to the cabin, waiting for the right moment to creep closer. If anyone has heard about similar stories or strange happenings in the area around British Columbia, near Vancouver, I'd love to know. This mystery has stuck with me for years, and I doubt I'll ever fully let it go. Sometimes I even dream about the Raincoat Man, watching him get closer with every flash of lightning. Thanks for reading. Edit. No, I don't want you to narrate this on your low-effort cash grab YouTube channel. Edit 2. Thanks for the gold, kind stranger. These past few months have been a nightmare, and last night just added to the misery. I was walking home from work, heading to my apartment where my spouse was waiting for me. The days are getting shorter, so it was already dark as I made my way through the streets. I always feel uneasy walking alone at night, so I kept my key lanyard in my hand just in case. As I was nearing my building, a man appeared from a side street and crossed over to walk on my side of the road. I was already walking fast, just a block and a half away from home, but my heart started racing. As I passed under a street light, the man called out to me. I ignored him. He called again, but I kept my head down and walked faster. He shouted, "What's your problem?" But I just yelled back, not interested, and picked up the pace. That's when he angrily yelled, "Don't be such a bitch." I could hear the aggression in his voice, and my instincts kicked in. I bolted. I sprinted toward my building, and soon after, I heard him chasing after me. I reached the front door of my apartment complex and yanked it open, slamming it shut behind me. I quickly shoved my key into the lobby entrance, got inside, and locked the door. The front lobby has glass walls, so you can see everything outside. I figured the locked door would be enough to stop him, but just to be safe, I hurried toward the stairs. Some of my male neighbors, who I'm friendly with, were sitting in the lobby chatting. They greeted me, and I waved back, trying to play it cool despite the panic coursing through me. But then a loud crash echoed through the lobby. My heart nearly stopped. My neighbors started yelling as I turned around and saw that the guy had shattered the glass door. He either kicked or punched it, breaking most of it, and was now trying to reach through the broken glass to let himself in. I screamed to my neighbors. He followed me here. I don't know him, and ran up the stairs as fast as I could. Once I reached my apartment, I slammed the door and immediately told my spouse what had happened. We called 911 right away. The police arrived shortly after and took my statement. They searched for the guy, and after a few hours, another officer came back with an update. Apparently, the guy had cut himself on the broken door, leaving blood behind, which made it easier for the cops to track him down. They caught him a little later. He wasn't new to the area, though turns out he's known to the police as an addict who has been harassing people in the neighborhood for money. There have even been suspicions that he buys drugs from dealers around the complex, but they've never been able to catch him in the act. Honestly, I'm not even shocked. This isn't exactly a great place to live, but it's all we can afford until we can move somewhere better. Still, I'm exhausted from living like this. I shouldn't have to sprint for my life just to get home safely. It was a crisp December day, just after Christmas, and I had recently turned 6 years old. My mom had to step out for a while and left my 16-year-old cousin in charge of me and my 2 older siblings, my brother, who was 8, and my sister, who was 11. My cousin decided to take us on an adventure into the city, just 10 minutes away from where we lived. We boarded the bus and set out, exploring the city's vibrant streets. Despite my cousin being little more than a child herself, he wandered through some of the city's less secure neighborhoods. After hours of roaming, We grew tired and decided it was time to head back home. In the heart of the city, there was a central area for buses. It wasn't a bus station, but rather a large, square field adorned with some plants, flowers, and bushes. All four sides of this square were lined with bus stops and benches, making it a bustling hub for various bus routes throughout the county and city. Since it was just after Christmas, the bushes around the field were still draped in colorful Christmas lights. As we waited for our bus, I wandered away, captivated by the twinkling lights. My cousin, who was caught up in her own world, didn't notice me straying. As I admired the festive display, a man approached me. He greeted me with a cheerful hi, and I looked up to see him smiling down at me. In hindsight, it was clear he was homeless and possibly on drugs. His long brown hair was damp, his clothes were tattered and dirty, and his teeth were stained black along the gums. But to my 6-year-old mind, none of this seemed alarming. I simply smiled back and replied, "Hi." He then asked if I liked looking at the Christmas lights, and I told him that I did. They were so pretty. He then made a proposition that I would never forget. "If you like Christmas lights, I've got some really cool lights at my house you'll love. Wanna come see 'em?" Excited by the idea of seeing more lights, I eagerly agreed and reached out to take his hand. We began to walk away, heading towards the corner of the field where a few tall buildings loomed. He said his apartment was just a couple of blocks away, and we were headed around the corner of one of the buildings. Just as we were about to turn the corner, I felt a sudden yank on my arm. I turned to see my sister, who had been frantically searching for me, pulling me away from the man. The man didn't say a word. He simply turned and ran as soon as he saw my sister. It took me years to fully grasp the danger I had been in. My siblings often talked about the incident, and as I grew older, I came to appreciate the gravity of the situation. Had my sister not intervened, I would have been led away into the city, with no one knowing where to start looking for me. The thought of disappearing around that corner, unseen and lost, was terrifying. To this day, we sometimes reminisce about that close call, thankful for the quick actions of my sister. As for the man, I hope we never cross paths again. I'm a young woman living in Iran, and I've created this anonymous account to share experiences that, if posted on my main account, could put my safety in jeopardy. Living here during such a turbulent time feels like walking a tightrope, and every action, no matter how small, can have serious consequences. As many people know, Iran is currently experiencing a revolution. For 2 months now, people have taken to the streets protesting the oppressive regime that has ruled over us for so long. These demonstrations are not just limited to daytime rallies. At night, the cries of "down with the dictator" echo through the streets and alleyways, coming from windows and rooftops as a form of silent resistance. Every night, after the chants die down, a tense quietness lingers in the air, and with it a sense of fear, but also hope. Tonight was one of those nights. After the last round of chants, when the streets had finally grown quiet, I decided to step outside for a quick smoke. Living just 50 meters from the main street, I didn't think much of it at first, but there was always a sense of paranoia looming over me. I wasn't wearing a hijab, which, in this country, is more than just a fashion statement. It's a rule of survival. Despite the constant fear of being caught, I told myself it was just a short walk. Nothing would happen. I could feel the tension in my body, but I tried to shake it off as paranoia, something that had become a constant companion these past few weeks. As I stood there, trying to calm myself, everything seemed normal. The streets were silent, the air still, For a moment, I allowed myself to relax, thinking maybe I was being overly cautious. Maybe, just maybe, I was letting the fear get the better of me. But halfway through the alley on my way back home, my heart sank. A group of 5 massive men appeared in the distance, slowly approaching. One of them was holding a speaker, blaring one of our protest songs that have become symbols of resistance and defiance. 2 others were shining laser beams into the windows on either side of the alley, and the remaining men held guns. These were the forces of the Islamic Republic, tasked with intimidating and hunting down those brave enough to raise their voices against the regime. They weren't just there to patrol, they were trying to provoke people into revealing themselves. By playing those protest songs, they were baiting anyone who might feel emboldened to show their solidarity. Hoping to catch them off guard, as they got closer, I could feel my pulse quickening, my breathing growing shallow. My mind raced. I wasn't wearing my hijab. This could be the moment that would change everything for me. My life could shift in an instant. Should I run? Should I turn around? The distance between us was closing fast. I forced myself to keep walking, every muscle in my body tensed, trying to appear as calm and unbothered as possible. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact, praying they wouldn't notice me or, worse, stop me. With each step, I felt as though my heart would explode from the anxiety. The seconds stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Their footsteps echoed louder as they neared me, and I held my breath, hoping I wouldn't give them any reason to stop. Just a few meters from home, but it felt like a lifetime away. The fear that gripped me in those moments was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I was utterly alone, standing in that alleyway with armed men from the regime just feet away, their weapons and cold demeanor exuding power and dominance. I didn't know if they even noticed me, but I didn't dare look up to find out. I was certain, in that split second, that this could be it, that I might not make it home tonight. Somehow I managed to walk past them without incident. My heart was racing, my hands trembling. It felt like I had escaped death itself. But as I reached the safety of my front door, a wave of overwhelming relief washed over me, mixed with terror. How close I had come to danger. I'm still trying to process everything that happened. The fear of living in a country where something as simple as stepping outside without a hijab can be life-threatening is exhausting. Every day feels like a battle between wanting to live freely and the fear of the consequences. But in moments like these, I'm reminded of just how brave the people here are, those who risk their lives every day to stand up for what they believe in, despite the oppressive forces that try to silence them. This revolution is more than just protests. It's about reclaiming our rights, our dignity, and our freedom. And even though the path is terrifying, it's also filled with hope. We are not alone in this fight, and I believe that one day our voices will break through the walls of fear and bring about the change we so desperately need. Growing up in the secluded, wooded countryside of Illinois, I never feared my surroundings. The area was remote, 7 houses spread across 0.5-acre lots, or larger, tucked far from town. No one ever got lost out there, and we didn't have large wild animals roaming around. In the 20 years I lived there, it was safe, quiet, and predictable. So when this happened, it shook me to my core. I was around 14 at the time, and my neighbor Terry, a few years older than me, lived just next door. We were close friends, and sometimes, when he'd come home late, he'd toss rocks at my second-story window to get my attention, and we'd chat through the night. My room faced the backyard, and from my window I could always see if Terry was out or back home. thanks to the light over his side door. One summer night, I heard Terry being dropped off at his house. It was around midnight, and I called out softly from my window, asking if he wanted to chat. He didn't respond, so I decided to sneak out and try to scare him. I was good at sneaking around, having spent my childhood learning how to blend in with the woods. I tiptoed out the back door, carefully avoiding the gravel that would give me away. I crossed the oak log rounds we had set up in the backyard, expertly making my way to Terry's house, where I'd hoped to startle him. As I got closer, I saw the light over his door go off, meaning he had gone inside. But something in the woods caught my eye. A dark, human-sized figure moving slowly through the trees between our houses. It was odd, though, because whoever it was wasn't using the path Terry and I always took. Instead, they were moving carefully through the thorny wild rose and raspberry bushes, which no one would willingly walk through. I crouched down, waiting, thinking maybe Terry had spotted me and was trying to turn the tables on me, sneaking up to scare me instead. But as I watched the figure, something felt off. The movements were slow and deliberate, like someone trying to avoid being noticed. I whispered for Terry again, but there was no response. I grew bored of waiting, so I quietly snuck back inside, locked the door, and returned to my room. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps in the yard below my window. I pressed my face against the screen, trying to see who it was, and whispered for Terry again. No answer. Suddenly I heard a loud thud and a low grunt coming from the window well directly below me. My heart jumped. The window well was a deep, semicircle hole dug out to allow light into the basement window. Terry knew the layout of our yard, and there was no way he would have accidentally fallen into it. The sound was unmistakably human, not an animal. Whoever or whatever it was, they had fallen in, but managed to pull themselves out quietly. Panic washed over me. This wasn't a game. Someone or something was out there. I strained to hear more, and soon I heard the distinct crunch of footsteps on the gravel. Whoever it was stepped right onto the noisy rocks, something Terry would never do. He knew how to be as quiet as I was, especially with my strict parents around. I sat there, holding my breath, listening intently as the footsteps stopped. I pressed my face against the screen, trying to see, but the angle didn't allow me to look directly below my window. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to half an hour. The air was thick with tension, and every second felt longer than the last. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I asked Terry about the previous night, and he swore he had gone straight to bed after getting home. There was no reason for him to lie, and that's when I realized whatever I had seen and heard wasn't Terry. It wasn't any of our neighbors either. There were only a couple of other kids in the area, and no one could have been wandering around our yard in the middle of the night. There were no large animals in the region, no explanation for who or what had been lurking in the woods that night. All I knew was that it wasn't someone I wanted to meet again. Stranger in the woods, let's not ever meet. I usually keep to myself online, mostly lurking, but a memory from about a year ago recently popped into my mind. It was one of those moments that didn't really hit me at the time, but now I realize how terrifying it actually was. The whole experience was strange and settling and honestly hard to describe, but I'm going to give it my best shot. I was 22 at the time, and it was a normal afternoon when I met up with my dad at a tire shop. The shop was located in a part of town where crime had been increasing. Looking back, I'm not entirely sure why we chose that particular shop, but I went along with it. It was probably around noon, and my dad had brought his tiny Chihuahua with him. While he was talking to the mechanics, I decided to take the dog for a walk to kill some time. The shop was situated a little distance from a busy main street, probably about half a football field away. Between the shop and the street was a large, mostly empty field, and the area beyond the field was mostly residential. It seemed safe enough to walk around, considering my dad and the mechanics were close by. But here's where I made my mistake. The shop was fenced in and facing away from the field. So, in reality, nobody could actually see me from where they were. I had no idea that I was completely out of sight. As I walked the dog around the field, keeping a fair distance from the main road, everything seemed fine at first. Then, out of nowhere, a beat-up old car appeared, moving slowly down the busy street. The windows were rolled down, and the driver was staring right at me. I noticed him right away. The car was still quite a distance from me, so I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just overthinking it. My stomach dropped. He wasn't just passing by anymore, he was gunning it down the road. And then, to my horror, he swerved onto the side street where I was walking. He was driving incredibly fast, and before I could fully process what was happening, the car jumped the curb and was heading straight for me and the dog. It was like something out of a nightmare. The speed, the angle, the way he came right at us, it was terrifying. I froze for a moment, shocked and confused. My mind was racing. Was this guy really about to plow us down? What was he doing? Should I run? But part of me didn't want to turn my back on him. Every instinct told me to get away, but I couldn't seem to make myself move. It all happened so fast. I barely had time to think. And then, out of nowhere, a miracle. The uneven ground in the field must have had a dip or a hole, because suddenly the guy's car got stuck. One of his wheels started spinning, kicking up dirt, and I could hear him cursing loudly through the open windows. That was the break I needed. Without wasting another second, I scooped up the dog, fully ready to bolt. My heart was pounding, and I was on the verge of running when I saw him opening the car door. About to get out, I couldn't even make out what he looked like. My mind was in such a state of shock. I couldn't remember his race, his age, nothing. All I knew was that he was a big guy, overweight, and he was about to get out of that car. I was certain this was about to escalate into something much worse. Just then, another miracle happened. A truck pulled up beside us out of nowhere. It was a construction truck, and there were two young men inside. They rolled down their windows and, in a loud, clear voice, asked, "Is this guy bothering you?" Their question startled the man, and he immediately got back into his car. The relief I felt in that moment was indescribable. The guy managed to peel his car out of the hole it was stuck in, reversed quickly, and sped away onto the street without looking back. I stood there, stunned, holding the dog in my arms. It had all happened in a matter of minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. The two men in the truck were just as confused as I was. They had seen the whole thing unfold and stop to make sure I was okay. After the guy sped off, we stood there for a moment, trying to piece together what had just happened. None of us could figure out what the guy's plan had been. Was he trying to kidnap me in broad daylight, in front of potential witnesses? Why would he be so reckless, charging into the field like that? We couldn't make sense of it, but we were all relieved it hadn't ended worse. I'm incredibly thankful for those two men who stopped and asked if I was okay. If they hadn't been there, I don't know what might have happened next, and I'm equally grateful that the guy's car got stuck when it did, giving me that brief moment to escape. It was such a strange, terrifying experience, and I've thought about it a lot since then. That day, I learned a valuable lesson. Never take your safety for granted. I used to be overly confident about walking around in public, thinking nothing bad would happen. But after that and a few other unsettling encounters, I've realized how quickly things can go wrong. I've also learned something important about myself. In those fight-or-flight situations, I tend to freeze. It's not something I am proud of, but it's something I'm working on. I've been incredibly lucky, but I don't want to rely on luck or guardian angels anymore. Now I try to stay alert and aware of my surroundings. No matter where I am, it's a scary world out there, and sometimes danger comes when you least expect it. I'm just glad I was able to walk away from that situation unharmed. A few years back, I was living with an abusive boyfriend who often took his jealousy out on me. One night after a party, we got home and had a huge argument. He got so mad that he threw me out onto our porch and locked the door behind me. It was freezing cold outside, and all my things, phone, wallet, everything were still inside with him. I stood there crying and pleading for him to let me back in, but when he turned off all the lights, I knew it wasn't happening. Feeling lost and helpless, I decided to walk to a nearby gas station and motel, less than a mile away, to use their phone. It was late, about 2 a.m. and bitter cold, so I thought I'd call a friend and ask if I could stay at her place. I figured that was the safest plan. I started walking down Donner Pass Road, my mind focused on reaching the gas station as fast as I could. After a little while, I noticed a tall, white pickup truck coming from the opposite direction. I tried to avoid making eye contact, but then I heard the truck slow down and make a U-turn. My heart pounded in my chest. I forced myself to keep walking, trying to stay calm. The truck pulled up beside me, and a man rolled down his window. He asked what I was doing out so late, and I nervously told him I was meeting a friend at the gas station. He smiled and offered me a ride, but I quickly declined, saying that I didn't hitchhike. He said, "Good. I don't pick up hitchhikers. You don't look like a hitchhiker, though. You look like you need some help." He kept driving slowly beside me, insisting that he wasn't a creep. He even flashed what looked like a police badge, explaining that he was off duty and wanted to make sure I got to the gas station safely. In my panic and naivety, I let my guard down. When he offered me a ride again, I accepted, thinking it wouldn't hurt since the gas station wasn't far away. As I got into the truck, I noticed it was a bit messy. There were old newspapers on the floor, a full ashtray, and empty coffee cups scattered around. As I shifted my feet, I saw something that made me uneasy: handcuffs partially hidden under the papers. He quickly apologized, saying it was his hunting truck, but at least the truck was warm, and I felt relieved to be out of the cold. He introduced himself as John, and we started chatting. I told him about the fight with my boyfriend, and he joked about going back to arrest him, making me laugh a little. John told me he had a wife, 2 kids, and a dog, and I remember saying he seemed to have the perfect family. Everything felt strangely normal, at least for a moment. But then, as we approached the gas station, John drove right past it. My stomach dropped, and I nervously told him, "Oh, I think that's the one." But he didn't respond. As we drove closer to the gas station, my mind raced. I debated grabbing the wheel, but just as I was about to act, John started slowing down. Relief swept over me, but it was short-lived when he said in a cold voice, "Don't tell anyone, or I'll find you." He claimed he was just teaching me a lesson not to hitchhike with strangers. The truck almost came to a full stop when he told me to get out before he changed his mind. I didn't wait for him to say it twice. The moment his words left his mouth, I jumped out of the truck and bolted toward the gas station. My legs felt weak, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and that truck. As I ran, I suddenly remembered to check his license plate. I spun around, but only managed to catch a blurry glimpse of the last 3 digits before he sped off. Once inside the gas station, I rushed to the clerk, my voice shaky, and begged him to call the police. The waiting felt like an eternity, and I couldn't shake the fear that maybe the officer who'd show up would be John. I tried to calm myself, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. Finally, the police arrived, and relief flooded over me. When it wasn't John, the officer was someone I had never seen before. I gave him a full description of John's appearance, the type of truck, the partial license plate, everything I could remember. I even mentioned the police badge he flashed, saying he was an off-duty cop. The officer listened carefully and then went to check the security cameras in the gas station. After a while, he came back and told me there was nothing on the footage. I asked if I could take a look myself, but the officer refused. He asked if I didn't trust him, and feeling cornered, I quickly assured him that I did. The officer then offered to give me a ride to my friend's house, but not before lecturing me about hitchhiking. He kept asking me if I knew who Ted Bundy was, to which I nodded. I knew, of course, but in my desperation, I had been naive. Days passed, and I waited for news from the police about the report. But nothing ever came. Each time I followed up, I got nothing back. Once, they even told me my case number didn't exist. It was frustrating, but eventually I had to let it go. The fear I had slowly faded. Though it never disappeared completely, I asked my friend, whose house I stayed at that night, if she'd ever heard of anything strange happening in that area since. She hadn't. Maybe John really was just trying to teach me a lesson. If that was his goal, it certainly worked. I've never hitchhiked again, but even now, as I try to convince myself that it was all just a harsh lesson, I can't shake the feeling that it was much more than that. Whatever his true intentions were, I'm just glad I didn't get out of that truck in the woods. Writing this has been oddly therapeutic, so thank you for allowing me to share my story. Edit. I'm not a fan of the few people messaging me, claiming they're John, so if you could stop doing that, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks. I work as a cashier at a grocery store, and being in my early 20s, I interact with hundreds of people each week. That's part of the job. About 6 months ago, this man came through my line for the first time. Looking back, I should have recognized that something was off right from the start, but at the time, I treated him like any other customer. After all, it's my job to be friendly. He didn't look like he was in a good place, and when I asked the usual "how's it going today," he immediately launched into a sob story. Apparently his wife, or maybe it was his ex-wife, had kicked him out because she was having a psychotic breakdown, as he put it. That probably should have been my first red flag, but I felt bad for him and tried to be empathetic. He was trying to buy a hot roasted chicken, but in my state, food stamps don't cover hot food. Feeling sorry for him, I did a little cashier trick to make sure his food stamps would cover the meal. That was my first mistake. He was extremely grateful, but that act of kindness was a turning point for him, and not in a good way. From then on, he came to the store every Monday, always going through my line and always buying a hot chicken. At first, I thought I was just helping someone who was down on their luck, but each time he came, he trapped me in long conversations. Initially, it was all about his ex's psychotic behavior. He called her crazy and a narcissist, and since I couldn't exactly leave my register, I just listened. After some time, his situation improved a little, and he moved into a hostel. While he seemed more stable, he was still clearly depressed. He'd tell me how much he appreciated talking to me and how it cheered him up. I even told him that I enjoy our conversations, which I honestly did at the time. Maybe that wasn't the best thing to say, but I didn't think much of it. He also started asking me about my work schedule and when I got off. At that time, I was too naive to see anything wrong with it. At one point, he got really excited because he'd found a used keyboard and was thrilled to be writing and playing music again. I thought it was nice and mentioned that I played the piano too. That seemed to click something in his mind. From then on, every conversation we had revolved around music, with him encouraging me to start playing piano again. He even told me I'd make a great music teacher, though he had never seen or heard me play. I didn't think too much of it, smiled and nodded, and continued to do my job. Then came the moment where I really messed up. One day he asked for my email, and though I gave him a burner email that I never intended to use, I still regret giving it to him. He started sending me music, some of his own compositions, some of his favorite songs. I never responded, and I could tell that upset him. But by this point, things were starting to feel weird, and I didn't want to open another line of communication with him. I had already had enough at work. Not long after, he asked for my phone number, but I declined. He said he wanted to finally have a real conversation with me, despite the fact that I had never replied to a single one of his emails. My coworkers, who had noticed our interactions, often commented that he was taking things too far. One even called him a creep, but I brushed it off. I thought I was just being friendly to someone who was struggling. Over time, everything my coworkers had said started to sink in. I began avoiding him. Every Monday I knew he'd show up, so I'd take an extra break during the time I expected him to arrive. I just didn't want to talk to him anymore, and the whole situation was creeping me out. Then, during one of the busiest weeks at the store just before Thanksgiving, I couldn't avoid him. He came through my line, but this time he didn't even buy his usual chicken. He just got a bag of chips and waited in line for 5 minutes, despite other registers being open. It was clear he was there just to talk to me. He told me, once again, that I had saved his life, and that this time he'd written a song to return the favor. I didn't know how to respond, so I just said I'd listen to it and let him know what I thought. I saw the email later, but didn't open it. The whole thing made me feel uneasy. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had gone too far. He wasn't just thinking about me when he was in the store. He was thinking about me when he was at home, while writing music, and who knows when else. Meanwhile, I was dreading Mondays, knowing he'd come in. The whole situation filled me with anxiety. Things came to a head today. After my break, I saw him getting off the bus just as I was heading back to the floor. My coworkers knew I was trying to avoid him, and when I started to panic, I ran up to the break room. About 15 minutes later, one of my coworkers came to tell me that he had been doing laps around the store, clearly looking for me. He didn't buy anything and left, but I was still rattled. I waited a little longer before going back out, but the moment I got to my register, my anxiety returned. Thankfully, my coworkers were watching out for me. I didn't see him enter, but the next thing I knew, he was making a beeline for my register. One of the other cashiers offered to help him at a different register, but he ignored her and kept coming toward me. I could feel the panic rising as I started moving away from the registers. He followed, apologizing and calling my name. I ran to the break room just as the store manager who I had recently spoken to about the situation, opened the door. I blurted out, "He's back. He's following me." The manager went down to deal with him, but by the time they got there, he was gone. Once again, he hadn't bought anything because I wasn't his cashier. I had a full-blown panic attack in the break room. My coworkers were there for me, telling me it wasn't my fault, but I still felt guilty. I felt guilty for not setting boundaries earlier, for not telling him how uncomfortable he was making me. The store manager said his behavior was completely inappropriate. He only came in on Mondays, only when I was working, and only bought something if I was at the register. Everyone agreed it was stalker behavior. I ended up leaving early and calling out for the next day. I'm still in disbelief over the whole thing. I just hope I never have to see him again, especially not next Monday. For the past 3 months, I have been experiencing what seems like targeted hacking by another tenant in my student accommodation, and it's making me feel unsafe and paranoid in my own home. It started with my Bluetooth speaker. I'd be listening to something while doing housework, and out of nowhere, my device would disconnect. Then the hacker would take control, blasting creepy and inappropriate music. The main song they kept playing was F*** with an Anchor by Alastorm, a song I had never heard before. The content of the song freaked me out, and no matter how many times I tried to turn it off, they'd turn the volume up full blast and start it again. This happened twice, and after that I stopped using my Bluetooth speaker entirely, thinking that would be the end of it. I was horrified when they hacked into my PlayStation. They played the same song at full volume, and no matter how much I tried to pause it or exit the app, they wouldn't stop. I ended up unplugging the PlayStation and haven't touched it since. But the most disturbing incident happened just yesterday. I was on the phone with a friend talking about some personal stuff when I asked my Google Nest a question. As soon as I did, I heard a ding from the device, which I knew meant someone else had taken control of it. This time they played a different creepy song, one I didn't recognize, but the lyrics I remember were, "Times are getting hard, boy." That really scared me because I was in the middle of a personal conversation, and it made me feel like they were listening in on everything I was saying. I'm now terrified that this hacker has found a way to listen to my conversations or spy on me. The fact that we all share the same Wi-Fi in the building makes me think it's someone living here, taking advantage of the shared network. I reached out to my landlord, but all they did was send out a warning email to the tenants telling me I needed to talk to my internet provider. I called the internet provider, and they said they couldn't do anything to help. I don't know what to do anymore. I've given up using my Bluetooth speaker, my PlayStation, and now my Google Nest, but it seems like no matter what I do, they keep finding ways to invade my space. I feel like I'm losing my mind, and I'm scared to stay in my own apartment. Does anyone have advice on what I should do? I'm desperate for help. This is a story I do not like to talk about, but a friend encouraged me to share it to get it off my chest. It happened over Halloween weekend, and the memory still haunts me. My friend and I were invited to a college house party in a wealthy part of town. The house was huge, with a pool and a vast amount of land. The party was themed to be a little naughty, so my friend dressed as a sexy nurse, and I went as a belly dancer. The house was packed with around 70 people, but it was so spacious that moving around was easy. I am not much of a drinker, but I had a juice drink while hanging out with my friend and others who were taking pictures. After what felt like an hour of posing for photos, I grabbed my drink, forgetting I had left it unattended. A man who looked like he was in his late 20s or early 30s approached me. He said my boyfriend had been trying to call me, which made me realize I did not have my phone with me. Since my boyfriend and I always make sure to stay in contact, especially when one of us is out, I panicked. Thinking it might be something serious, the man offered to let me use his phone to call my boyfriend in one of the rooms. I followed him without thinking twice. If my boyfriend needed to talk to me, it must have been important. But as soon as we entered the room, I felt winded, like I had just run a mile. The man sat me on the bed, gave me his phone, but my body felt weak, and I could not even dial. My head pounded, and before I knew it, I was lying down and out cold. When I woke up, I was confused and disoriented. My friend was there, frantically cleaning my stomach with a napkin and shouting. It took me a moment to realize I was in a bedroom, and as the fog lifted, I had a full-blown panic attack. I feared the worst, thinking something horrible had happened while I was unconscious. My friend reassured me it had not gone that far, but I still felt violated. She explained that when she could not find me after some time, she began searching for me, eventually finding me passed out in the room with the guy. She saw him doing something disgusting. He had been using my unconscious body for body shots, licking salt from my chest and drinking alcohol from my belly button. He even kissed me while I was passed out. I felt nauseous just thinking about it. My friend immediately called my boyfriend, who had finished work early, and rushed to pick me up. She also tried to ask around about the guy, but no one seemed to know him or remember seeing him at the party. I was taken to urgent care, and thankfully, there was no lasting physical harm. The drug he had slipped into my drink only knocked me out, but the story did not end there. I started receiving creepy texts from an unknown number. At first, just random questions. I ignored them, but then the person sent a picture of my torso from that night, along with disturbing messages. It was clear he was stalking me. The texts continued for a while, and I thought about baiting him to finally catch him, but I feared what might happen if things went wrong at it. I want to thank everyone who reached out to me. Your kindness means a lot, especially since trusting strangers has been hard for me since this incident. Thankfully, the texts stopped just before Christmas, though I still feel uneasy in public sometimes, thinking I see him or feeling like I am being followed. I contacted the police, and they took my phone to copy the texts, but I am not hopeful anything will come of it. I think he was just someone with bad intentions who took advantage of the moment. I am not as upset anymore. I just want to move on with my life and grow stronger from this experience. Sorry for the long update, but I do not think anything else will happen. If it does, I will update you all. Thank you again for your support. This happened a few months ago, back in October, when I was at home with my mom. We live in a very rural part of New Hampshire, where the houses are spread far apart on narrow side roads. It had been raining all day, and by the evening it was pouring. I was sitting on the couch when the doorbell suddenly rang. Our front door has a large glass pane, allowing us to see out and for someone to see in. Standing outside, I saw a man wearing a poncho. I didn't have my glasses on, so I couldn't see him clearly. He noticed me looking and gave a friendly wave, which made me hesitate. I decided not to open the door, feeling uneasy. Instead, I went to my mom, who was getting ready for work in her room. When I told her about the man outside, her face went pale. She immediately locked the bedroom door and checked all the windows. I was confused, so I asked her what was going on. She explained that on her way home, she had seen the same man standing motionless by the side of the main road. When she turned down our street, she noticed him walking as if he were following her. At first, she thought nothing of it but became worried when he showed up at our house. My panic began to rise as I realized this wasn't just a normal visitor. My mom called my aunt, her best friend, for advice. She urged us to call the police. So we did. While we waited for the officers to arrive, we kept pacing around, trying to see if the man was still outside. We couldn't see much from the angle of the windows, but the tension was unbearable. Finally, after what felt like hours, a police car pulled up. We cautiously unlocked the door and explained everything to the officer. He agreed to search the neighborhood for the man. As he left, I noticed a small piece of paper hanging on our doorknob. It was a political ad for a candidate running for office. Could this poncho man have been a campaigner? It didn't add up. Why would someone go door to door in a downpour, especially in a rural area where the houses are spaced so far apart? Plus, it was around 4 in the afternoon, a time when most people wouldn't be home from work. The whole situation felt off. The officer returned after a while, saying he had found the man down the road and questioned him. The poncho man claimed he was indeed campaigning and had been knocking on doors, but when asked for more door signs, he conveniently couldn't provide any, stating ours was the last one he had. The officer found it suspicious, but couldn't do much, as the man hadn't committed any crime. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a police car stationed nearby. My mom explained that there had been several break-ins on our street, and the police were keeping an eye on the area. Although I couldn't prove it, I had a gut feeling that the poncho man and the break-ins were somehow connected. Thankfully, we never saw Poncho Man again. We upgraded our doorbell with a camera, and the police eventually left the neighborhood. Even though things have quieted down, I still get uneasy thinking about that strange encounter. I hope we never meet Poncho Man again. I spent my slow day at work yesterday reading through stories on this sub, so I thought I'd share my own little story. It happened when my childhood best friend, Marie, and I were around 11 or 12 years old. Marie's family owned a campsite in a provincial park about 2 hours from our hometown, and they would spend the entire summer living there. One summer, I was lucky enough to stay with them for a week, and we were excited to spend our days exploring the forest. On the last evening of my stay, we decided to head down to the ice cream shop by the lake before it closed. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light over the forest. We took a path down a small slope next to the main road. On one side of the path was thick forest brush, and on the other side were more trees, separating us from the road. It was quiet, no other people around, just the two of us, walking and chatting. Suddenly, we heard a rustling noise, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps running behind us. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but the footsteps were too human. I turned to look, but Marie grabbed my arm, her voice tense as she whispered, "Don't look back." I listened to her, feeling her panic sink into me. My heart pounded as we quickened our pace, without breaking into a full run. The ice cream shop was only about a minute away, but suddenly Marie yanked me to the left, steering us away from the shop and toward the lake where boats were docked. At that point, I knew something was really wrong. Marie, visibly shaken, got us a kayak from the boat rental, and we paddled out into the middle of the lake. Only then did she tell me what she had seen. A man in a long black coat, with his hood up despite it being the middle of July. He had emerged from the bushes right after we passed, running towards us. When Marie made eye contact with him, he stopped abruptly, a twisted smirk on his face. She swore she saw him put something shiny into his coat before he stood there, watching us. As we sat in the middle of the lake, I handed Marie the Nokia phone my parents had given me for emergencies. While she dialed her family's number, her face went pale, and she pointed toward the shore. I turned and saw the man again. He had followed us around the edge of the lake. He circled the path twice, never taking his eyes off us. As the sun sank lower and lower in the sky, we were terrified, fumbling with the phone as we tried to reach her family. Thankfully, after what felt like hours, someone finally came to pick us up. By the time we reached the shore, the daylight was almost gone, and I could not shake the feeling that if we had not been able to call for help, things could have ended very differently. Looking back, I still wonder why we didn't just go straight to the ice cream shop and ask an adult for help. But we were scared, and I guess panic led us to the lake instead. Thankfully, we made it back safe, and we never saw that man again. Edit. I've had way too many people ask to use this story for their podcast or YouTube. If you want to use it, I don't care, credit or don't credit. Just please stop messaging me about it. There's an old, abandoned house on the country road between my town and the next. I'd been there before, twice actually, with my sister and my best friend. The house is ancient, dating back centuries, according to the bank records I was able to dig up. You can tell just by looking at its 2 stories with a basement, still full of furniture and random items scattered throughout. Despite being vacant for decades, it feels like whoever lived there just vanished, leaving everything behind. Both times I'd gotten in through the broken cellar door, which was propped open with some large sticks. It had been about 2 years since my last visit, but this past summer, another friend of mine heard about the place and wanted to check it out. I didn't think it was a dangerous trip, so I agreed to take him. After all, it was more interesting than anything else. We parked across the street, in the lot of an industrial building nearby, to avoid drawing attention on the rural road. Even though it wasn't busy, we didn't want to deal with anyone questioning us. My friend, who was braver than me despite my prior visits, led the way across the street to the front of the house. He peppered me with questions about what I'd seen in there. I told him about the expired food still sitting in the kitchen, and how I'd even taken a board game from one of the upstairs rooms as a weird souvenir. As we walked from the front of the house toward the back where the cellar was, I noticed there was a lot more brush than I remembered. My previous trips had been in the spring, and I hadn't encountered the thick foliage that now made it difficult to move through. I mentioned the change to my friend as we picked our way through the overgrowth, trying to find the cellar. After some effort, we pushed through and found it just as I had last seen it, broken open and propped up. We stood there for a moment, nerves starting to build as we stared at the dark opening leading into the abandoned house. Something about the way the sticks were arranged to hold the door open felt different, but I chalked it up to my anxiety and didn't say anything out loud. My friend insisted I should go first, since I'd been there before. I hesitated, taking a few minutes to calm myself, but eventually I worked up the courage to step down into the cellar. It wasn't easy getting in. Half of the cellar had collapsed, so there was barely enough space to maneuver. I had to duck under the part of the door that was still intact, inch my way down the steps, and then twist sideways to squeeze through the small gap into the basement. My nerves got the better of me for a second, but I made it through, and my friend quickly followed. We stood in the corner of the basement, our phone flashlights cutting through the darkness. There was a spider web blocking the path to the stairs leading to the first floor, so I found some sort of tool lying nearby and used it to knock the web down before tossing it aside. We talked quietly, though I can't remember about what taught, and then we fell silent. That's when we both heard footsteps. Above us, the floorboards creaked, as if someone was walking right above our heads, moving toward the stairs leading down to the basement. I remember this part vividly. I glanced at my friend, expecting him to react to the footsteps I was hearing, but he didn't seem fazed at all. Just as I was about to ask if he heard it, he turned to me with a serious look and said, "We need to go." Without another word, he spun around and practically sprinted up the stairs. I remember thinking how insanely fast he moved. He reached the top in what felt like seconds and turned to offer me his hand. I was a bit slower, but I managed to hurry up the steps as well, and he pulled me through the narrow opening. I stumbled onto my hands, knees, quickly scrambling to my feet as I faced the overgrown brush. I turned back to see my friend crouch by the cellar door, staring down into the darkness. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaky. He didn't respond right away, just kept looking back into the cellar before finally telling me to go first. I didn't hesitate. I rushed through the thick weeds, not caring about the scratches I got from the overgrown branches. We made it to the front of the house in no time. My friend kept urging me to stay in front while he trailed behind, constantly looking back and flashing his light into the first-floor windows. "What are you doing? Are you okay?" I asked, feeling my anxiety spike even more. He didn't answer at first, so I pressed him again, asking if he had heard the footsteps. He turned to me, his expression serious, and told me he had. That's why he was watching the cellar so closely, to see if anyone followed us out. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. After he had pulled me up from the cellar, he turned back to guide me through the weeds, but just before he let go of my hand, he saw something, someone standing at the bottom of the cellar. He said he could only see their bare feet and part of their legs because of how collapsed the cellar was. That's why he had told me to go first. He didn't want to risk anything happening before we got out of there. He hadn't seen them come up the stairs or move from the spot where they stood. At first, I didn't believe him. I thought he was just trying to scare me, but there was something in his voice, serious and almost fearful, that told me he wasn't joking. I asked again, more out of disbelief than anything, but he firmly said he wasn't lying. He reminded me that I had heard the footsteps, too, so I knew there had to be someone or something in that house. We both stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking, just processing what had happened. Then we agreed to get out of there and made our way back to the cars. For a while we stood by the cars, watching the house to see if anyone would come out, but nothing did. After talking about how insane the whole thing was and my friend reassuring me again that he was telling the truth, it started to rain, so we decided to call it a night. I believe him fully. He's never changed his story, and I can tell by the way he talks about it that he's still shaken by what he saw. I haven't been back to that house since, and I like to tell myself that it was just a homeless person seeking shelter. But still, the thought of how close that person was to me as I scrambled up those cellar stairs gives me chills to this day. When I was around 9 or 10, something really strange happened at school that I'll never forget. It was during lunch break, and we had a 2-hour recess, so my friends and I were out playing just like everyone else. But that day, we started noticing a crowd of people gathering in front of the school. This was unusual because usually there were just a few people walking by. But on this day, there were at least 20 people standing there, all with their phones out. One woman caught our attention. She walked right up to the school entrance and started taking pictures of the kids. We could tell because her phone's flash kept going off. An adult from the school saw her and went over to tell her to stop, but she didn't listen. Instead, she smiled at him in this creepy way and said something, though I couldn't hear what it was. Her expression was like how a mother would comfort you, whispering, "It's going to be okay." But the whole thing was so unsettling. The adult got upset, understandably, because taking pictures of random kids without permission is just wrong. After a few minutes, the woman finally left, but that didn't solve the problem. The rest of the crowd was still there, and they were all taking pictures too. I remember one guy specifically. He was pretending to be on a phone call, but he wasn't talking. His phone's flash was on, so we quickly realized he was also taking pictures of us as kids. We thought it was some kind of game. We started playing hide and seek with them, joking around and saying things like, "Oh no, they flashed me, I'm gonna die." We thought it was fun at first, but things got serious when one of the people outside tried to open the school gate. He didn't really need to, though the fence was low, and if he had wanted to, he could have easily climbed over. That's when the headmaster snapped. She came outside, furious, and yelled at the group for a solid 10 minutes. Then she called the police. After she calmed down, she told us that these people claimed to be involved in some kind of voodoo. According to them, they were taking our pictures to use for strange purposes, like selling them or even causing us harm. The kids thought it was ridiculous and laughed, but the adults were not amused at all. To this day, I don't know if the headmaster was telling the truth, or if any of those people got arrested. I never found out what happened to the pictures they took. The one thing that still haunts me is the smile of that woman. It was so eerie that it made me uncomfortable for years. Even now I get anxious when people take my photo. Even if it's just family or close friends, I'm still not sure what those people were doing outside our school. But that day left a lasting impact on me. I've been hesitant to share this story because I was scared my stalker might somehow see it and retaliate. But a few years have passed, and I think I'm ready to talk about it in detail. I knew my stalker. In fact, back in high school, he was my biggest crush. I was a freshman, and he was a senior when we first crossed paths. At the time, it felt like our story belonged in a movie. It was the Tumblr era. 500 days of summer was everything, and I was consumed with the idea of finding some kind of perfect cinematic romance. One day, I was walking home from school when I stumbled across a note on the ground. It was a conversation between two students, filled with jokes and doodles, clearly something they had been passing back and forth in class. At the bottom, one of them had signed the note with a name that was impossible to forget. "Let's call him ... and you are I ... Later that same day, I was scrolling through Facebook when I noticed a comment from a guy named Nuri on one of my friend's posts. Immediately, I recognized the name. It was the same Nuri from the note I had found. I couldn't believe it. I commented back, saying something like, "This is wild, but I found one of your notes outside after school today." From there, we started talking. We messaged each other non-stop over text and Facebook for the next few months. I was completely smitten. To me, he was one of the most beautiful people I had ever seen, and we texted like we were already boyfriend and girlfriend. But meeting up in person was something we kept putting off. It just felt so nerve-wracking and awkward after all that time of just texting. Instead of meeting face-to-face right away, we started doing these cute things around school. He would hide notes for me in the library, leave me comics in secret spots, and even drop off bags of Sour Patch Kids, my favorite candy. It all felt like some kind of romantic game. Eventually, though, we did meet in person, but the night ended with me getting sent home by the cops. I had snuck out with a friend to meet him on the beach, but it was after curfew, and we were caught. I got grounded for months, and after that, things kind of fizzled out between us. Years went by, and I had moved away from our hometown for school. I started working at a restaurant downtown in a bigger city while finishing my courses. Nuri had disappeared from my life, and the last I saw on social media, he had moved to California. We hadn't spoken in ages. Then one day, out of nowhere, he reached out to me online. At first, it was light and nostalgic. We caught up, laughed about our puppy love days, and everything seemed perfectly normal. But then one day, during a break at work, I checked my phone and saw 15 messages from him. He had sent me songs, random comments, and even some old high school expressions I used to say the messages were strange and intense. He was practically begging me to respond, upset that I hadn't answered him right away, even though I had been working. It was unsettling, to say the least. The sudden flood of messages threw me off, and from that point on, I stopped responding to him. But the messages didn't stop. In fact, they got weirder. He started sending me poems and random nonsense, like he was desperate to get my attention. One time, I carved a pumpkin for Halloween and posted a picture of it online. His response to that was just one example of the kind of strange, obsessive messages he kept sending. The messages kept getting stranger. One day, he sent me a bizarre text responding to a picture I had posted of a pumpkin I carved for Halloween. It went like this. A little imperfect pumpkin sat on a wall. The little imperfect pumpkin had a great fall, and all the queensmen couldn't put little imperfect pumpkin ... together again. And what if the wind came out of a cloud by night, chilling and killing your little imperfect pumpkin? What's gonna save it from falling away? A few days later, he sent this. Knock, knock, she's around here somewhere. I can feel it. Spidey senses tingles. So that's where she is. Must be real serious this time. Heads around back and sees it. A cellar door, guarded by mermaid roses and red lipstick smooches, impenetrably approaches, kneels and drops in a note before slightly slinging away. MJ. We knew the time would come. I'm just about finishing the fight at home, and sense a much bigger threat creeping around the corner. I can only fight so many bad guys alone. Magic, my name. You're my only hope. Just give me a sign. I'll know how to read it. Your friendly, out-of-this-world neighborhood Spider-Man. Another message was even more confusing. Contact light. Capcom. Do you read me? Mission Control. Are you there? Radio silence. This is your captain speaking. I've awakened from cryosleep to a code super red warning. The star's gravity field propelled my ship into orbit. Impossible to escape. The star is collapsing, splitting at the seams, and now the whole thing's tumbling down. A champagne supernova in the sky. This is my final transmission aboard my Instagram name. I'm coming home. The final message before I blocked him came after I posted a video of my dog. I had captioned it, "He's so perfect." His response was chilling. What if he disobeys your commands? Is he perfect then? Besides, there's more fun to be had when one side is playing hard to get and the other is playing fetch. I'm finna fetch me some of that. My Instagram name. Do you know where I can get me some of that sweet? Not following the rainbow on this one. That would take me to a pot of mold. And you wouldn't lead me to a pot of mold. Would you? That's when I blocked him. I thought that would be the end of it. Months passed, and I began to relax. Then, one day at work, I was walking by a table when a man tapped me on the shoulder. It was during the COVID pandemic, so everyone was wearing masks, but this guy's mask made my heart sink. It was a bright Sour Patch Kid mask. I hadn't seen him in years, but I recognized those dark, empty eyes instantly. It was Nuri. He asked, "If I want to get a drink, do I order with you?" I mumbled something about grabbing a bartender and rushed to the bathroom to lock myself inside. I texted one of my friends from high school, someone who knew all about the weird messages I had been receiving from him. I wrote, "Oh my God, Nuri is here." She responded, "Oh yeah, I didn't tell you, but he's been reaching out to me about you. He said he doesn't know why you blocked him and thinks you're playing some twisted game." The last thing he said was, "I just have to know she's okay." I was terrified. I hid in the back of the restaurant and called my dad. He told me to unblock Nuri and try to get confirmation that he was, in fact, there for me. I did as my dad suggested and typed, "Why are you here?" His response, "I'm just following the rainbow. I went outside to get some air, but Nuri followed me. He tried to talk to me, and I ran back inside, but he followed me again." I was so scared I couldn't think straight. My dad ended up picking me up from work, and escorted me back to my apartment. Nuri had planned everything. He found out where I worked, flew across the country, booked a hotel right next to my job, and figured out my schedule. He came prepared, even bringing gifts. After I hid in the back, he handed a pouch to the bartender to give to me. Inside was a Harry Potter pen that said always, a bag of Sour Patch Kids, and a creepy, cryptic note. That night I sent him a long message, telling him never to come near me again. His response, "I knew something was wrong since I haven't heard from you since the full moon of January 2020. For a few weeks, I was constantly looking over my shoulder, but nothing happened. 2 years passed, and I thought I was in the clear, but then a few months ago, I got a notification on Instagram. One of his accounts had liked an old photo of mine. That familiar sense of dread returned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he would be back. To my insane, delusional high school stalker, I hope we never meet again." This happened in the mid-'80s, and I was about 7 years old. I've checked with my family, and we all remember it pretty much the same way. It was one of those afternoons where it was just me, my 2 older sisters, and 2 of our cousins, all girls. My oldest sister, who was around 11, was the one in charge of babysitting the rest of us. Our house was a 2-story box house with a flat roof, and it had a small front porch, also with a flat roof. That detail becomes important later. At the time, we were all inside, playing or just hanging out, when we started hearing strange noises. It sounded like someone walking on the roof, and every now and then, we'd hear rocks or something being dropped down the gutters. Being kids, we thought it could have been a squirrel or some other animal, but the noises didn't stop. They kept going. That's when my oldest sister came up with a terrifying theory. What if someone had climbed the big tree next to the house and gotten onto the roof? The idea sent a wave of fear through all of us, especially since we knew there was a roof access point in the bedroom I shared with my sister. What if whoever was on the roof could get inside? My older sister decided to send my other sister and one of our cousins to the corner store across the street with instructions to look up at the roof when they came back. So the 2 of them, both around 8 years old, walked halfway across the gravel parking lot and being curious kids, turned to look up at the roof. That's when they saw him. There was a man crouching on our roof, wearing one of those crop football jerseys that were popular in the 80s, the kind you see Johnny Depp wearing in A Nightmare on Elm Street. My sister and cousin came running back, screaming and freaking out, telling us about the guy on the roof. Now, my oldest sister was terrified too. She ran over to the neighbor's house to use their deck in the hopes of getting a better view of the roof, but she couldn't see anything from there. Desperate, she called the police. It felt like it took forever for them to show up, and when they did, they didn't seem to believe a word we said. The cops thought we were just a bunch of kids making up stories. One of them drove down the street and up a small hill to see if he could get a better angle on the roof. But because of the way the house was built, you couldn't see anything unless the person was standing. If the man was laying flat, he'd be invisible from the street. Then came the part that still baffles and infuriates me to this day. The cops told us, the 5 little girls, ages 7 to 11, that we had to go upstairs and check the house for this man. They sent us, crying and terrified, to search the bedrooms, knowing there was an access point to the roof. I can still feel the fear of that moment. None of us wanted to go upstairs, but they insisted, and so we went. I remember how scared I was, but how well can little kids check for a grown man hiding somewhere? We didn't really know what we were doing. The police didn't search the house. They didn't check the roof. They just left. And there we were, 5 terrified girls, wondering if the man was still up there, if he had jumped down, or if he had somehow gotten inside and was hiding. Hours later, my mom finally came home, and we told her everything. She assured us that the roof access was locked and that no one could have gotten in. But she checked anyway, just to make sure. Then she went outside to investigate. That's when she found it clear footprints in the dirt. They were dug in deep, like someone had jumped off the roof onto the porch and then down into the flower bed. My mom was furious. She realized that we had told the truth, and the police hadn't believed us. The next day, we all went to the police station. They separated us and interviewed each of us individually. We all told the same story. My mom was beyond mad that the police have it, telling them off for not taking us seriously. We never found out who the guy on the roof was or why he was there. Did he know it was a house full of young girls home alone? The thought still creeps me out to this day. We were lucky nothing worse happened, but that memory has stuck with me all these years. I shared a story here once before about something that happened when I was a child, but it has been a while since then, and I hope I'm doing this in the right format. This happened just a month ago in Shinjuku, Tokyo, Japan. I'm a 28-year-old white American woman from Alaska. I'm slightly above average height and have some distinctive features. My waist-length hair is half blonde, half dark brown, and I have tattoos all over my upper body, including on both arms. I wouldn't consider myself an easy target to kidnap. Last month, I was in Japan for 2.5 weeks with my fiancé, family, and some friends. We were a group of 12 people. I speak Japanese fluently, so I felt pretty confident navigating the city, even on my own. It was Friday night during Golden Week, and the day before we were supposed to leave Japan. Our group decided to go out drinking to celebrate our last night. The area we were staying in wasn't the nicest, but it wasn't terrible either, just a little dirtier with more tourists and a few homeless people. Every night we went out, the men in our group were propositioned by prostitutes, and sometimes we'd see people passed out on the streets. That night, we were all supposed to meet in front of our hotel before heading out. and I happened to be the first one there. Although I wasn't with my group, the area was crowded with hundreds of people, so I didn't feel alone. I stood outside the hotel waiting, when suddenly a man approached me way too close for comfort. There was no reason for him to stand inches from my face. Given the space around us, he looked to be around my age, probably 25 to 35, and he was black, with an unsettling look in his eyes. The conversation went like this: stranger. Hello, where are you from? Me. I'm from Alaska. Double quotes, stranger looking excited, almost crazed. Oh, American. Me. Yes, where are you from? Stranger. Ghana. Are you here alone? Me. No, I'm with about 15 people, including my husband and dad there in that shop right there. This was a lie. I was with 12 people, including my fiancé, and no one was in the nearby shop. Stranger. What hotel are you staying at? Me. I don't know the name. It's across the city. Another lie. We were standing in front of my hotel. Stranger. How old are you? Me. 35. I lied again, trying to make myself seem older. Stranger. Right? Come with me. Me. Yeah. No thanks. I started to turn and walk away. Stranger. Yes. Come with me. We'll take something. Me. Nope. Bye. I quickly walked toward a nearby shop. Stranger muttering. Take something. Wake up in paradise. Thankfully, he didn't follow me, and I waited for my group inside the store. I immediately messaged my fiancé and another friend, and they came down right away. Looking back, I realize I should have stopped talking to him much sooner. At first, I thought he might just be a guy hitting on me, so I planned to politely turn him down. But as soon as he started asking where I was staying and if I was alone, huge red flags went up, and, looking back, it struck me as odd that he never asked my name or if I was married, which someone hitting on you might normally do. Even though this happened in one of the safest countries in the world, you can never be too careful. Moral of the story: always trust your instincts, especially as a woman. Don't feel bad about blowing off strangers, and be careful about the information you give out. I shouldn't have even told him I was from Alaska, but thankfully I realized quickly that he was sketchy and stopped giving him any real details. This happened over 10 years ago, back when I used to go out drinking with friends at metal and goth bars on Friday and Saturday nights. I think that year a goth girl had been assaulted and left for dead, only identified later because of her tattoos. After hearing about that, my friends and I were always extra cautious when we went out. After the bars closed, I never liked to be alone, so most nights a friend and I would wait at a 24/7 coffee shop until the subway opened again at 5:30 a.m. It wasn't ideal, but it felt safer. However, one night things didn't go as planned. My friend Claire, who usually stuck with me, decided she wanted to hang out at Rick's place, a guy we both knew. Fine, I thought. We'll go to Rick's and wait it out there. But as the night went on, I started feeling awkward. It became clear Claire wasn't planning on leaving any time soon. She was flirting with Rick, and it looked like she wanted to stay longer, maybe even sleep with him. By 5 a.m., I was done waiting around. I decided I would make my way to the metro station on my own. I asked for directions, but back then, all we had were basic flip phones. No smart maps or GPS to guide me. Rick gave me a general idea of where the station was, and I headed out alone into the cold, empty streets of Montreal. At first, everything was fine, just a quiet, dark winter morning. But then I heard footsteps. My heart sank. Crap, what now? I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably just someone else heading to the station. Still, I didn't dare look behind me. I kept a steady pace, knowing that if he was a predator, showing fear could make things worse. The footsteps continued, matching my pace exactly. I started to think this was more than just coincidence. What if he's following me? The idea chilled me even more than the winter air. To test it out, I crossed the street in a zigzag pattern, first to the left, then back to the right. Sure enough, he followed every time. Now I knew. He was definitely following me, playing some kind of twisted game. Was he trying to scare me, intimidate me, or was it worse than that? I couldn't tell, but I wasn't about to let him see me panic. I kept walking, scared but determined not to show it. The streets felt endless, and I had no idea how much longer it would take to find the station. Finally, in the distance, I saw it, the metro station. But just before I could reach it, the wind blew my scarf ahead of me. Oh no, not now, I thought. My hands fumbled to grab it, but I didn't stop moving. I prayed that the split-second distraction wouldn't give him a chance to do something. At last, I reached the station, and as I stepped into a zone with other people, I felt a wave of relief. There were people on both platforms, and I finally felt safe. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know who it was or what he wanted. All I know is that on those cold winter streets near what I think was Metro Papineau, I had been followed, and I hoped to never meet that person again. This happened when I was about 11 or 12 years old. It was the start of summer, and I had begged my mom to let me go to the water park in the next town. She couldn't drive, so she arranged for her friend to drop me off and pick me up afterward. I was a decent swimmer and had been to the park alone a couple of times before. My mom gave me money for admission and a little extra for snacks and drinks. Once I arrived, I got changed, strapped the locker key around my ankle, and went straight to the slides. It was early evening, around 6 p.m., and the place wasn't too crowded, so I got through the slides quickly. My favorite slide was the river rapid one, where you slid down sections, splashing into pools in between. Most people didn't bother using the rubber rings, and no one really monitored the slides, so it was a free dash for dash all. After going down the river rapid slide 4 or 5 times, I splashed into the first pool and hung around for a bit. I was about to head down the next section of the slide, which leads to an enclosed, dark pool. I liked to hang out in that pool before finishing the ride. But this time, someone was already there. It was a larger woman, maybe in her 30s or 40s, lying on her stomach with her feet over the edge of the slide. Her head was above the water, and she was laughing a loud, hysterical, guttural laugh. She looked me straight in the eyes, still cackling, and pushed herself down the slide, her laughter echoing through the tunnel. I was freaked out, so I waited a few minutes before sliding down to avoid running into her at the bottom. Thinking it was just some random weirdness, I went back to the river rapid slide. Again, there was no one around. I went down the first section, but as I entered the dark pool again, I heard that creepy, hysterical laughter. There she was, the same woman from before. She stared at me, grinning and laughing uncontrollably, and again she pushed herself down the slide. I was terrified. I decided then that I wasn't going back on the river rapid slide for the rest of the day. I headed over to the Black Hole slide, a one-person tube ride. You're supposed to wait for the light to turn green before going, so I thought I'd be safe. But as soon as I flung myself into the darkness, I heard a second thud behind me. I glanced back, and to my horror, I saw the shadowy figure of the same woman. She had followed me into the sleigh, and once again she was laughing loud, breathless laughter, like she'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. I have never been more scared in my life. Panicking, I pushed my hands against the slide floor, trying to go faster, but she wasn't far behind, still cackling. When I finally reached the bottom, I threw myself out of the landing area, scraping my knee in the process. I ran straight to the changing rooms, locked myself in a stall, and yanked the locker key off my ankle. I grabbed my stuff, got changed as fast as I could, and bolted out of the building to call my mom. She had her friend come to pick me up right away. So, to the creepy laughing woman at the water park, let's never meet again. This happened to me 20th last summer, and I still get chills thinking about it. That day I was out thrifting with my boyfriend, 2M, and on the way home I suggested picking up sushi for dinner at the grocery store nearby. Since my boyfriend works night shifts, he was already feeling tired and offered to head home while I went by myself. We live in a busy part of the city where everything is close by, and our town is generally safe with very little crime. But looking back, I wish I hadn't gone alone. As my boyfriend and I parted ways, I walked through the grocery store parking lot when a man approached me. He was tall, around 6'5", stocky, and probably in his 40s, with a wide smile and wide eyes. "Wow, you are stunning," he said. I thanked him quickly and tried to walk away, but he blocked my path. "I have never seen someone as beautiful as you before," he continued, and immediately I felt a sense of dread. I looked back, hoping my boyfriend was still nearby, but he was long gone. Maybe it sounds like an overreaction, but I've been into true crime stories for years, and with my social anxiety and being a smaller woman, I've always been cautious. The man reminded me of a more muscular version of Art the Clown from Terrifier, minus the clown makeup, but just as creepy. He kept talking, asking my name and age. I gave him a fake name and said I was 19. His eyes lit up as he laughed and said, "That's good. That means you're a true woman now. What in the world?" My boyfriend later told me I should have said I was under 18 to throw him off, but I seriously doubt that would have helped. The man then held out his phone and asked for my number. I refused and told him I had a boyfriend, and he said, "I just want to talk to you." I repeated that I had a boyfriend, but he didn't seem to care. His smile never faltered, as if he didn't understand or didn't care. "So you don't want to cheat on your boyfriend?" he asked, stepping closer. At this point, I was terrified. I looked around, hoping someone would intervene, but people were just walking by. His smile suddenly vanished, and he placed a hand on my back, saying coldly, "Come on, I have a nice car I can drive you around in. Let's check out one of these restaurants." Seeing his demeanor change so quickly, like a switch had flipped, was something I thought only happened in movies, but experiencing it firsthand made my blood run cold. Panicking, I pushed away from him and almost shouted, "Sorry, I really need to buy my groceries." Thankfully, people started to stare, and his grin reappeared. "All right then," he said quietly, "I'll see you later." Fake name. I rushed into the grocery store, my heart pounding. When I glanced back, he was still standing in the parking lot, staring at me. I wanted to get his license plate number, but it was too late. I called my boyfriend, but it went to voicemail. I tried to calm down, thinking he'd be gone by the time I finished shopping, but I was wrong. It was getting dark by the time I left the store. As I was walking home, I heard a car pull up beside me, and a familiar voice shouting, "Hey." Hi, hey, my heart dropped. I looked over and saw the same man, leaning out of his car window, grinning maliciously. So where's your boyfriend? He taunted, laughing like it was all a game to him. I didn't acknowledge him, not wanting to show my fear. I couldn't lead him back to my house, but turning back to the mall would only confirm I was trying to escape. Thankfully, the city's rec center was right next to my apartment complex. Without looking back, I quickly crossed the street and headed into the rec center. Praying he wasn't following me, I finally glanced behind me once I was inside. Instead of following me, he sped off in the opposite direction. Relieved, I called my boyfriend, who had just woken up. I told him everything, barely holding back tears. He came to the rec center to walk me home, and I felt stupid for not getting the man's license plate number. But I was too consumed with fear to think clearly. I did call the police, giving them a description of the man and his car, but I never heard anything back. I haven't seen the man since, but his creepy smile still haunts my dreams. It terrifies me that he could be out there, preying on other women. For my sake, and for the women in my city, I hope I never have to see him again. One night, my friend and I decided to explore a local spot he'd been talking about for a while, a massive storm drain near an old, possibly abandoned house. The house looked like it had been left to decay, a tarp draped over it, likely due to asbestos contamination, a big issue in my area. I wasn't too thrilled about breaking into an abandoned place, but my friend assured me we weren't going there. Instead, he pointed toward a creek next to the house. I wasn't really into the idea. I would have much preferred getting hammered at someone's house, but we kept walking along the creek bank. After what felt like an hour, we arrived at this huge storm drain. It looked ancient, with moss covering the sandstone walls, making everything slippery. My friend mentioned the drain hadn't been used in years, though it still seemed to be maintained by the local council. We crouched down and made our way through the tunnel. The stench of mud and dirty water was overwhelming. Eventually, we found a small opening in the concrete wall, slipped through, and emerged on the other side. What greeted us was disgusting moss, brown sludge everywhere, and damp pipes. I told my friend this wasn't a good idea anymore, but he insisted on going further. And honestly, I was curious too, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe. We walked through the maze of pipes and columns until we reached another room, smaller than the last. He sat down, opened his bag, and pulled out a bottle of alcohol. He had a few sips and offered me some, but I declined, feeling buzzed enough from earlier drinks in the park. As we sat there, we looked into the tunnel at the far end of the room. It was pitch black. You couldn't even see your hand in front of your face. That's when my friend had the not-so-bright idea to explore the tunnel. He said he'd go alone if I chickened out, and, well, I did. I told him I wasn't down for it, so he shrugged and went on ahead. For about 5 minutes, I sat there alone, waiting in the stillness. Then suddenly, he came sprinting back down the tunnel, terrified. He swore he saw something crawl past him in the dark. I tried to calm him down, telling him it was probably just a rat or that the drinks were messing with his head, but he wasn't having it. Without wasting any more time, we grabbed our stuff and made a break for the exit, crawling back through the small opening and heading out to the creek. We glanced back into the drain, but there was nothing. We went back to my place and talked about it for the rest of the night. Even though we were safe and nothing seriously happened, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something about those huge, empty infrastructures designed to carry tons of water through the city just creeps me out. At the end of the day, my friend got spooked, but it's definitely an experience I don't want to go through again. Selling items online seems like a harmless way to make extra cash, but it can quickly become unnerving when things feel off. A few months ago, I was selling a wind-up watch when I had an encounter that left me shaken. I initially received a message from someone, let's call them, who seemed interested in buying it. However, from the very beginning, something about A's behavior felt strange. They were unusually pushy in their messages, constantly shifting the time they would come to pick up the item. I tried to brush off my unease, convincing myself that I was overthinking the situation. One red flag, though, was asking if I had change for a large bill before even arriving. I clearly told them I didn't have any cash on hand and suggested they bring the exact amount. They agreed, but I had an odd feeling in my gut. When I finally showed up, they didn't park directly in front of my house, which was already weird. Instead, they parked around the corner where I couldn't see the car, and my anxiety spiked. It felt intentional, like they didn't want me to know exactly where they were or who else might be with them. When it came to my door, things got even stranger. They handed me an incorrect amount of money, despite knowing I didn't have change, then asked me to get in their car so we could go find change together. Alarm bells went off immediately. Who invites a stranger to get into their car just to get change? That's when I tried to explain, "Oh, I'm from Europe, and we don't worry about getting into strangers' cars." That only made the situation more suspicious to me. If anything, it felt like an excuse to manipulate me into feeling comfortable. I firmly declined, standing my ground, saying I wasn't about to hop into a stranger's car, regardless of where they were from. At this point, I started asking more questions about the watch, as if stalling for time or trying to assess my reaction. Mind you, the watch was brand new, and I had already told them this several times, but they kept circling back to it, asking unnecessary details about how to set it and how it worked. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were buying time for something else. The tension was building, and my instincts were screaming at me that something wasn't right. Finally, I left to go get change and returned a few minutes later. This time I noticed the car for the first time, and so there were multiple people inside. My stomach dropped. The sight of those other people just confirmed every bad feeling I had. It felt like they were setting me up for something much worse. At that moment, my only goal was to get out of the situation as quickly as possible. I grabbed the money from May's hand, handed them the watch, and bolted back into my house without looking back. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't help but feel that I narrowly escaped something far more dangerous than a simple watch sale gone wrong. Looking back, I wondered if I had made a big deal out of nothing, but honestly, I don't think so. There were just too many red flags: A's pushiness, the vague car parked around the corner, their attempts to get me into the car, and the unnecessary questions. While nothing explicitly dangerous happened, it was a situation that could have gone south very quickly. I think the worst part is the realization that sometimes trusting your gut is the only thing standing between you and potential harm. It's easy to second-guess yourself, to wonder if you're overreacting or being paranoid. But this experience made it clear to me that it's better to be overly cautious than regretfully naive. So, to anyone selling items online, always trust your instincts and be careful. The money isn't worth risking your safety. If anything feels off, don't hesitate to back out. You never know what could happen otherwise. When I think back to my childhood in the late 80s and early 90s, the freedom we had seems surreal by today's standards. There were no smartphones, no GPS trackers, and our parents just let us roam. My best friend and I, both around 9 years old, spent our days exploring on our bikes, sometimes disappearing for hours at a time. We attended a private school, which meant our holiday schedules didn't always align with the other kids, making our adventures feel like we had the whole world to ourselves. It was early September, and the air still had that lingering summer warmth. That afternoon, we had decided to play in a park near our homes like we had countless times before. Everything felt normal until a police officer approached us. She seemed urgent, more serious than any adult we'd ever encountered while playing. "Girls, I need you to leave this park," she said sternly, her eyes darting around as if she were searching for someone. "A dangerous man has escaped from police custody. If you see him, do not approach him. Call the police immediately." She then proceeded to give us a description. Tall, thin, wearing a WASTCOAT. As soon as the officer left, our imaginations took off. At that age, I was obsessed with the Secret 7 books, where kids like us solved mysteries and stopped bad guys. Suddenly, we weren't just two girls playing in the park. We were detectives on a mission to help capture a criminal. Instead of heading home like we were told, we decided to keep wandering. Maybe we'd spot the man and be heroes. We meandered through the quiet streets for what seemed like hours, the officer's words playing over and over in our heads. Each passerby seemed a little suspicious, but none of them fit the description, at least not until we reached a school. It was just after 3 p.m., and children were pouring out of the gates. The school was one we knew well because we attended brownies there. As we stood watching the kids head home, I suddenly felt a chill. Standing near the gates, almost blending in with the crowd, was a man. My heart raced as I whispered to my friend, "Look, it's him." He fit the description the officer had given us perfectly except for one detail. He wasn't wearing the waistcoat, but something about the way he stood there, just staring at the kids, sent shivers down my spine. There was no reason for him to be there, no child waiting for him, no reason for his eyes to linger on the young faces. My stomach knotted in a way I had never felt before. Without thinking, we bolted to the nearest phone box. My hands trembled as I dialed 999, my heart pounding with both fear and excitement. I felt like the heroes in my books, calling the police to save the day. I told the operator everything, where we saw him, how he fit the description, but wasn't wearing the waistcoat. They thanked us for the tip, and with that, we hung up and continued on with our day, the adrenaline slowly fading as we wandered off, proud that we might have helped catch a criminal. Years passed, and the memory of that day became one of many childhood stories I'd tell for laughs. But as I grew older, the details of that afternoon began to resurface, and they no longer felt exciting. Instead, they felt terrifying. I began to realize just how close we had been to something truly dangerous, something we were too young to fully comprehend at the time. Now, as an adult, the thought of that man sends a chill down my spine. Who was he, really? Did the police take our call seriously? Was he just some random guy who happened to fit the description? Or was he something far worse, someone who could have harmed the children, or even us? The realization that we were playing in that park, unaware of the danger lurking nearby, makes my skin crawl. I'll never know what came of that man, or if our call helped prevent something terrible. But one thing is certain: what started as a childhood adventure became a haunting memory that will stay with me forever. I was browsing Marketplace when I stumbled upon an ad for a Saturn Vue. The SUV was listed at about 50% below market value, labeled as being in great condition. I immediately thought it was a scam, but my curiosity got the better of me. The ad had a phone number, so I decided to call it. A young guy answered, sounding friendly, and claimed the vehicle was in perfect shape. When I asked why he was selling it, he mumbled something about wanting something sportier. Despite my skepticism, I agreed to check it out. However, things quickly took a turn for the strange. The seller insisted that I bring cash. A dark feeling crept over me, a warning sign, but I brushed it off. I had the money and decided to proceed. As I drove to the address he provided, my unease grew into full-blown dread. I was seconds away from arriving when I called him again to confirm. His first question was, "Do you have the cash?" My gut twisted. I answered yes, but something told me not to park in front of the house. Instead, I parked a block up the street and waited. As I sat there, scanning the area, I noticed something unsettling. There was no Saturn view, no vehicle for sale, and the street was eerily quiet. Then a white Audi station wagon slowed down in front of the house. Inside, a group of young men scanned the area, looking tense and on edge as if searching for someone or something. They didn't see me, hidden a block away with my envelope of cash. I watched as they slowly drove past, their eyes darting around. My heart raced as they drove off. It felt like something was terribly wrong. My gut had been right. This wasn't about a car. It was about setting someone up for something much worse. I drove home, feeling a mix of shame and relief. Later, I reported the incident to the police, providing them with the ad number and phone number, and urged them to investigate. Days passed with no apparent action on their part. Eventually, news stories emerged about people being lured by similar ads told to bring cash, only to be threatened and robbed. No detailed descriptions of the perpetrators were given, just vague warnings to be cautious. Even now, I wonder what might have happened if I had gone through with it. What if I had ignored my instincts and walked right into their trap? All I know is that sometimes a great deal isn't worth the risk. Trust your gut. I live in a village near a small forest with very slender trees. When I was about 12, my close friend and I were playing in the field by the forest. We often spent time there, wandering around, playing with sticks, and hitting them against rocks or trees. It was a familiar place, and nothing unusual about it. One day, as we were strolling through the forest, we stopped suddenly. Ahead of us, about 10 to 15 meters away, we spotted something strange. At first glance, it looked like a boar because of its pig-like nose. However, upon closer inspection, its body seemed more like that of a German shepherd. What was even stranger was that the creature moved behind one of the slender trees and simply vanished. It didn't move far enough to be out of sight. It just disappeared behind the tree and didn't reappear on the other side. We watched it for about 10 seconds. I turned to my friend and asked, "Did you see that?" After a few more seconds of silence, I glanced back to find him running away as fast as I had ever seen anyone run. Feeling anxious, I quickly followed him out of the forest and back to the field. We looked back, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. We were both unsettled and confused. If it had been a regular animal, it would likely have run away when it heard the loud noises we made earlier. I still live in the same village, but I have never encountered that creature again. Sometimes, late at night, I hear strange sounds coming from the forest and the field, which keeps me on edge. The mystery of what we saw remains unsolved, and I still wonder what it could have been.